Hey, John.
Hey.
Your mouse and it'll look, and he goes,
Well, I'm
picks
hopeful
up his
that
mouse and starts
our
running.
three other members will be coming in a little bit late. I know I got stuck in some traffic again here. We got a lot of guests here tonight, and I would just ask one thing here. You're in an observation role. This is not a public hearing, and we're not gonna have time to take more than 15 minutes of comments at the end of the meeting. I personally feel like you're misinformed by your executive director. I appreciate you being here very much, but I really need you to cooperate and help us get our work done by being quiet during the meeting. So thanks.
Casey,
The-
in all of the other meetings of all of the other work groups, there was a public comment part and
We do have that at
participation that did count in the meetings themselves.
Yeah, and on the advice of.
And I didn't do this because of the executive director or something.
No, but on the advice of the legal department at FWP, at Becky Doctor, we've reserved 15 minutes at the end of every meeting. And the intent of the work group, and I'll just kind of kick off the meeting this way, the intent of any of the Fish, Wildlife and Parks work groups is these are the folks that are intended to roll up their sleeves, get the work done, and then come back, in Mike's case, come back to his constituents, get feedback along the line. And then we're going to be taking recommendations to the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And in turn, there will be the regular 30-day public comment period on the FWP website. We'll encourage all of you to attend the commission meetings where these topics are discussed. And then your feedback is recorded properly, and all 7 commissioners get a copy of the feedback, which is not going to happen tonight unless they want to watch the live stream, which I'm pretty sure none of them are doing that. So that's the process. So you're really here in an observation role. We'll have 15 minutes of comment at the end. The other thing is, I think there was an expectation that we're going to make hard decisions on these topics tonight, and the subgroup leader has told me that we're not doing that. So this is the first time this work group has formally discussed the topic of commercial caps. And this was developed by a subgroup of the work group, and the rest of us are hearing it for the first time along with all of you. So that's kind of where we are.
So Casey, because I was brought up twice already. And I'll just reiterate what I said in my email, that I work for Fishing Outfitters Association of Montana.
Of course, I
And
know
I'm
that's why
on
you're on
this
the group.
in the capacity to represent them and inform them of the happenings of what's going on. And my email to our membership was not meant to be disrespectful in any way. I know some people perceived it as that, but at the same time, in a public work group representing outfitters on a topic that's critically important to their livelihood, it's I for one will stay as long as necessary tonight. If people have something to say, I think it's incumbent upon us, and it's our responsibility as work group members to listen to what they have to say to make a better informed decision as we go forward.
Okay, where I would take exception from that is I think it's really your job to get that feedback and bring it to the meetings and represent it. In the case of Jim Hart, he's on this work group to represent hotel owners, commercial interest owners, and members of the Ennis community. If he sent an
Some of which are here.
But if he sent an e-blast to the Chamber of Commerce in Ennis and said, tonight's the critical night, you better be here, then we're going to run out of space as it is. But I mean, if we did that with every meeting, we'd have the same.
But
we'd have the
Casey,
same result of prior
Casey.
efforts.
Casey, this is
Yeah.
Allison. John Sampson is texting me. He cannot hear the meeting, so I don't know if it's something on his end or on your guys' end, but he's not able to hear.
If he can't hear us at all, Allison, if you could let him know to try dialing in via the phone.
Okay.
That
Okay.
might help, because we're hearing you just fine, so I suspect it's on his end.
Okay, I'll text him.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I guess from my point of view, I'm glad people are here. I want to look at Dan and tell you, you did a hell of a job. I personally made 3 additional trips to Bozeman over the last month in between this meeting and the last. Mike attended. We had Brian, we had really robust discussion. It was incredibly informative. And I'm particularly excited about what we're going to cover tonight. I mean, I think there's some real meat here, and feeling like we've got some real crystal clarity on what the decision points are going to be, need to be. And I think everybody is still of a much open mind and excited, frankly, to share it with our fellow committee members. So with that, I'd just soon get this thing on the road.
And we'll do that.
Thank you.
I think right now what we're working toward is the June 23rd commission meeting. If we make a decision at that commission meeting, then it would go out for the 30-day notice, and we'd be able to vote on this formally on August 25th.
Okay.
I just want to echo your comments. I've known Dan for over 20 years, and I really believe we could not have a better suited person and more capable person to be leading the charge on this thorny issue. And Dan is and I've been in a business group together. I think of him as one of the most successful business people in the state, and also a very talented attorney. And Dan, I really appreciate your leading the charge on this.
I've just had to use my referee whistle a few times, so. Do we have a quorum or not? I mean, unfortunately, not having some of these other members is, because we've got Chris McGrath is not here. I don't think so.
He's on.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you are? Good, okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
So I think we have of 12, we've got 9.
9, okay, all right, well, great. Well, thank you for the comments there. Just to give you a little bit of an overview here, as Mac indicated, since our meeting, I think we started about 2 months ago, but over the last 6 weeks or so, we've held 3 group meetings of subgroup meetings. Mac, Brian McGeehan, John Sampson, Mike Bias were able to attend all 3 of these, and these were 2.5, 3 hour intense, lively discussions. Allison and Rich have been able to join us via Zoom for portions of those meetings, and we appreciate your input. I'd like to thank Brian over here, not surprisingly, as everyone knows, as the greatest data resource that we could ask for. And he's been crunching numbers and providing graphs to us, and we'll be sharing more of those in future meetings as we kind of evolve this. We've tried to summarize some of that in the report that we've submitted, but it has been in diplomacy, they would refer to some of our discussions as full and frank discussions, which means just short of throwing things, but a lot of lively discussion. And the topic of commercial management of the river, it's very easy to start jumping to conclusions and chasing down various rabbit holes. So what we've tried to do is really step back and break it down into, sort of fundamental questions for us to explore in an atmosphere where we could explore the options, explore the implications of it, look at the data that we could, and we're not at the position of making recommendations. We've got some things that are a little bit further along, but we have a lot of things that we've fleshed out. And that's what we'll be sharing here. I'm a generation past PowerPoint of growing up with it, so I'm not going to try to do a PowerPoint, but rather for members of the task force. I think you all have the report. I'm going to try to highlight some things through there. The most important part of tonight's meeting could be gathering questions and concerns from the members who were not the core of this subgroup, because I guarantee you, I could take the next hour and a half and open it up to our subgroup and you'll have a lively discussion. We've had lots of those. But more important is to get some feedback from the rest of the group, because eventually the entire group is going to be weighing in on these for recommendations. So I'd ask members of the group, primarily Brian, John, Mac, and Mike here that have been the core of this, to just kind of hold your comments and so that we could kind of give opportunities to others. There'll be plenty of opportunity to get in. I may call on you to clarify a few things as well as we go along. At our last group meeting, yeah, does everyone have a hard copy that here of our work group?
I'll take one.
All right.
I'm gonna write on it.
And then if you'd like. Yeah, oh, okay, yeah. At our last meeting, we just kind of reviewed the goals that we had discussed for the commercial outfitting side of it, and I'll just be very brief, but we're really driven first to this discussion over the last 10, 12 years has been on the perceived or real crowding social issues on the upper river, primarily during the peak season, although there's also the concern on reaction on the lower river of recreational, non-commercial usage. So how do we address that? And under the arm that came forward in 2020, we wanted to maximize and or protect and optimize the opportunities and quality of the experience for diverse users on the river. We wanted to have a practical, which probably means that it actually works, and least restrictive method for outfitters, guides, regulatory agencies, and the local business community in order to sustain a healthy local economy that is based on a healthy fishery and river experience. And fourth, to provide an opportunity for new outfitters to come into the commercial operation, and for existing outfitters to transfer all or portions of their permitted trip allowances. So those are sort of driving, and sometimes we come back to those as core principles, core goals. Again, trying to break this down into a manner that we don't chase down too many rabbit holes. Our first area that we explored was the key question of transferability of commercial cap days. And I think I can say that this is one of the core elements that we have unanimity within our work group, that an open, flexible, transferable system among outfitters to transfer user days or trip days, whatever you wish to call them, is a key element for a healthy management system. Some of the experience out of the Beaverhead Big Hole with restrictions and various things have been all brought to our attention, but that's perhaps a core element of it. Now with that, the arm that was passed in 2020, which is based on the special recreational use permit, the SRPs that you're all familiar with, and that is tied with your reporting of outfitter days, is a system devised under a cooperative management agreement executed in 2007 between the Bureau of Land Management and FWP to manage the fishing access sites, outfitter usage, your reporting system, your payment system. And the SRP and the ARM that was passed in 2020 are all tied in under that joint BLM FWP agreement. The consequence of that is that you are governed, we believe, and what we have received from FWP staff and legal counsel is you have the restrictions of the BLM and Forest Service, but federal restrictions on transferability of individual use days. That is not allowed under those systems. Now, there's some games that can be played when you sell your business for value, but it is not the ideal system. So our recommendation was that the SRP process, that joint management agreement, could stay in place and govern the existing access to fishing access sites for reporting and everything. But to ensure the transferability and the flexible management of a commercial cap system or limiting system, we really need a second regulatory scheme, a permit that is solely a state of Montana permit that would then fall under the provisions contemplated by Senate Bill 275 that was passed with MOGA and FOAM's efforts there that was intended to create flexible transferability of user days. As further as we kind of dug into this, and I thank Brian for a lot of the due diligence on this one, there appear to be some ARM languages elsewhere, just other than just the one that was passed 275 or the 2020 ARM that may conflict with SB 275's language on transferability. So I think maybe to open it up for questions, and again, maybe first from those that are not the direct members of the subgroup, but I think our recommendation is that we'd love to have some further input from FWP, from the commission, from staff, legal, as to what can we create this regulatory permit system that gives the transferability that we believe is critical to the rest of the system.
Charlie, I'm really going to need your help with this because it's not clear to me that that's going to come out of Fish and Wildlife. I think that's going to probably wind up being in the Hope's group.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd offer this, Commissioner, that if it's a legal question, I mean, we truly do need Becky Doctor, the legal staff, and you know, my experience can take you only so far. I think it is safe to say we are looking at recommending that the commission in April repeal a portion of the commercial use administrative rules that currently restrict or prohibit the transfer of days, and that is consistent or trying to be consistent with Senate Bill 275 now law.
You don't have a choice.
So that's coming.
And just, we weren't necessarily looking for an answer
Right.
tonight, obviously. These are sort of questions that go above our pay grade. But again, the sense of our group was that transferability, and you'll see it in other provisions down there of making it as straightforward, even mid-season leases, loans of days to be flexible is critical. So what that ARM might look like, or what's the process that would need to be used if we're moving forward eventually with recommendations, hopefully in June here for the specifics.
And Dan, since our meetings in Helena, you haven't gotten any clarification from either the governor's office
No.
or.
I mean,
I'm delighted.
the governor's office there did, Mike Freeman sort of came to the same set of conclusions that we almost need a state permit separate from the BLM FWP joint process. So that's where, how do we get to that state permit? And Brian, I think the Smith River uses a sort of a dual system, if you want to say.
Yeah, that's correct. So on the Smith, we have 2 permits. One is through the Forest Service, and that is related to the Forest Service campsites that we use. But the allocation of the number of launches is through a state permit. And through that, we are able to lease back and forth with other Smith River outfitters. So we already have a parallel system on the Smith that has a dual permit.
And that's run through parks.
That is run through parks because it is a state park. All other river recreation, there's about a page and a half of river recreation arm, that's under fish and wildlife. So parks would, we call it a park rule, correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie, if it becomes a state park or a state recreation area. Outside of that, there is extensive arm related to river recreation, and that's under the Fish and Wildlife Commission.
So maybe an action step that you could take, and it sounds like you're working on some of the ARM clarifications that we identified here in April, but would be to get further direction of what would the process be? Is it a new ARM? Is it some new, we called it a river use permit for purposes of our discussion in the paper here, that would obviously go through the public process and commission approval and such to replace the 2020 ARM that is linked to SRPs. And then whatever other details we have. So
Charlie, you do know that's going on, because I haven't heard or seen anything on the agenda yet for the.
Yeah, I mean, I can share that with you publicly, that because we've already gone to the Parks and Recreation Board with the front half of that. Because there is a piece in those administrative rules that speaks specifically to the Smith River. And both the board and the commission actually have dual authority. So we've already taken the first step in their preliminary decision to initiate a change is contingent on the commission and following suit. Now, that's tentatively going to be in front of you at the April meeting.
Okay, perfect.
I think though, the larger question, sir, if I may, I think what Member Larson's talking about, I think I understand it well enough, and if not, I'll seek further clarification that I can take that back in house. It'd be helpful. The more detailed your idea is, the more that will help our legal staff to truly think about legal implications. And then as far as the kind of the mechanics of how the permit systems work, that's something I can provide some support to you in terms of just some feedback or information to help.
that'd be great. And I'll be glad to connect up with you. Before I go on to the next thing, I'd like to just open up to our other group members, if you have anything to add on this first point.
I just think maybe as a action step, perhaps we or you or someone, we should draft a request to the department so we can get it crystal clear and not leave it to Charlie to have to carry it back. It'd be easy to ask the question and ask that we pursue it as a arm rule remedy first, because if there's a fee tied to it, I mean, we know what that means. That becomes a legislative issue, more than likely. So I would like to just craft the request.
And along those lines, yeah.
Mhm.
Why don't we,
Yep.
we're going to be meeting again
Yep.
as a subgroup here shortly after this, and we can try to refine that.
Mhm.
Just a clarification, or maybe a reiteration. Our suggestion is that the SRP process stays intact. It's the access to the river, it's the reporting mechanism, and it can be the fee collection part of it. And this is a sort of a new Montana layered permit that governs the authorized trip days or trips.
Would it be helpful, Dan, to clarify for some of the members of the work group and the community the reason for the intent to do that? Like, what's the, why is that a good thing? And why is that
The
a
transfer-
problem
the
on, the Big Hole and Beaverhead rivers where that does not exist?
Maybe let's come to that a little bit later on. I think it'll become more apparent.
On, that's an important, the idea of transferability within for allocated days is important, but I think it's not tied to the ARM, because I'm looking through the ARM here and it's not talking about the SRP in the ARM. It talks about historic use for 19 and 20. So it might be even easier than we're thinking to
There's a few
add to the
pieces
rule.
in existing ARM that's more related to overall river recreation.
Right,
management.
right. I
And
know
there's
the
a
ones
few
you
things
talked
that
about.
conflict that would need to be repealed or.
Right. That's in river recreation arm. I was talking about 1211 6705, which is
Yeah, it doesn't talk
allocated
about
cap.
SRPs, it's just.
And just to clarify, so the SRPs that are currently utilized would not be transferable.
Our understanding is that because of the BLM regulations, which are national regulations that specifically prohibit transfer of use days.
Well, specifically transfer permits. So typically what happens in the federal permit, whether it's a Forest Service permit or an SRP, in situations where there's a moratorium on those permits, which are often the case in Forest Service permits, if there is a transfer of a business, one business relinquishes their permit, and you have a contract that's approved by the agency, and then the other outfitter or business is granted a new permit, and then generally whatever was allocated in this permit then is populated.
But it's sort of an all or nothing, not the,
Typically it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the answer is yes, the SRP stays, it's not transferable. It moves ahead. We create a river use permit under which the days identified for 19 or 20 are allocated. And then that is the vehicle that allows transferability, free and open transferability between outfitters and new outfitters, and right sizing the use of it under the cap. There's no growth, there's still the cap, but you can, as a business, do what you need to do to stay viable. And it is fundamental to almost every other element that we have in front of us to discuss, that this principle be able to take place.
Got it.
this next one's more of a housekeeping detail.
Pause for a second. So
Yeah.
do you think the work group needs to take a vote on this tonight in terms of this April 19th commission meeting?
That might be a good idea. I mean, just if everybody wants to go on record. I mean, I think our subgroup is, as I said, I think this is one of those rare unanimity items, but it would be real useful to, and that's why we wanted to bring this to the entire group.
Does the rest of the group understand? Because it's kind of complicated, because you're working under the federal SRP system and we're trying to develop a state recreation use permit that handles the days underneath that federal system.
So if you're gonna ask for a vote, you should give the explanation first that Brian was asking for. Or if we're gonna get to that later, we should just do the vote later if that's necessary.
Well, maybe the best way to do it would be to put a motion that our subgroup recommendation would be for the entire work group to seek assistance from FWP and staff, in particular the legal, for devising a permit system that allows flexible transferability of days that are allocated under a commercial cap system. Does that sound reasonable?
Right, I think it's important too to point out that under the existing allocation cap that was December 2020, it's not anything that would need to replace or revise that at this time.
I think that's a secondary question that will be explored depending upon what we're doing.
Right.
I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that that one stays.
Under what we're looking to do.
So we're looking for a motion that says the group seeks to support from the department to devise an alternative river use permit, in quote, system that allows for full and complete transfer of use days. That's the motion.
That works for me.
Separate,
Individual.
separate from the federal SRP system. Or underneath it, or
I think without getting into details, if we say what we're trying to accomplish, I don't want to box in the legal people of coming up with a system that works.
right.
And then you're assuming after your motion is made, we have a discussion.
Exactly, yeah. So I'd make that motion if there's a second.
Second.
Or you're running this meeting. not me.
Yeah, no. So we have a second from Brian.
So,
Discussion?
Brian, you want to talk a little bit about the transferability and the issues on some of the other rivers?
The issue that we see in the big hole in the Beaverhead, on each of those rivers, there's a ration window where trips are limited. Those were originally defined by historic use of each outfitter. That was a long time ago. And times change and businesses change, they morph. The challenge is on the big hole in the Beaverhead is the only way for an outfitter to grow is to completely acquire another business. Permits over there are also, there's a moratorium on new permits. So the only thing that can happen there is that permits snowball and there's fewer and fewer permits over time. Then you have some outfitters that may have run a larger volume 20 years ago, and they're still outfitting and operating, but maybe not to the extent that they had in the past. There's no mechanism in place for them to be able to gift, to transfer some of that unused capacity. So it's a challenge for new entrants, for someone to come into that system. The only option is to buy another user. And there's very few permits now because they've consolidated. It's also very difficult for an existing outfitter to incrementally grow because of the lack of fluidity in that system. So the proposal is to have essentially a cap, but then have a lot of fluidity under that cap. What we do know on the Madison River with organic use is there's a lot of dynamic change from year to year to year of outfitter use. Some outfitters are declining, some outfitters are growing in use. And you want to be able to basically take what happens organically under a cap and still have, outfitters that grow like 10 trips a year, 10 trips next year. They've got to find someone to transfer with, but to allow that fluidity to happen, especially important for new entrants that come into the system. They've got to have a way to, this could be one way to have a more elegant, streamlined approach to enter the system that's capped.
One of our discussions, Zach, has been not having a too high of a barrier to entry. The Beaverhead there, because of the way it's been structured, one permit or to get access there, the cost has become very high. Whereas here, I mean, it could be potentially you could lease days for a year, you could purchase days and have that as an entry in. And then as your business grows or shrinks, you have some flexibility. So it's sort of trying to use a free market system to help manage the long-term application of a cap.
There's an important point of clarification on that too. Zach, under the BH2 system, the red big hole system, there's no federal oversight or memorandum of agreement between that permit system and some federal entity. But on the Madison, there is that. It's the BLM is the federal partner, cooperative partner, and the state. So the state, when they put in the Madison permit system, worked under the federal SRP system. That's the distinction. That's an important distinction between BH2 and what we have on the Madison. That the permit system on the BH2 is completely under the state and handled through the ARM system.
And may I clarify, when you guys worked on Senate Bill 275, which passed the legislature, was signed, but it specifically excluded the Beaverhead Big Hole system.
Correct.
Because that's sort of vested interests, I assume.
Well, that was the issue. The affected users, at least a portion of them, basically said, hey, that's fine and dandy for something new, but don't mess with a system that's working. So, the political reality was it wasn't worth the fight. And so I think the important part about Senate Bill 275 is that a portion of it explicitly, by a bipartisan vote of the legislature, said free and open transfer on allocated days is the intent. That they weren't ambiguous about it. And so anything going forward, we're charged to do that. These systems, that was the intent. That was when the gavel fell and the governor signed the bill, that set a different day. And so if we allocate use days in the future, they have to. So we're sort of bound to this, whether we make a motion or not, or what, we're sort of bound to doing this.
Subject to the federal restrictions.
Well, the federal restrictions are only a factor because they're the landowner.
Yeah.
And so they become a partner because they're the landowner, but under this system, they'll become parking lot attendants. And
right,
the
but
department,
that's the importance
Yeah.
of a
Yeah.
new Montana
Exactly.
permit as
Exactly.
opposed
Yeah.
to the SRP.
yeah, that's
Okay.
good.
That's
Yep.
all I was trying.
And then I guess I'd ask Allison, lends into your conversation that's coming later in the agenda about new outfitter entry, but maybe you can just say a few words about what you have in your memo and talk about this proposal in motion in relation to what you're going to talk about later in the meeting.
I had a little bit hard time hearing you, but I will tell you, I am in support of this. I think the easier we make it for an outfitter to manage the days that have been allocated, that's to our benefit. And I also think it makes it easier, like Brian alluded to, for a new outfitter to enter, because that gives the ability to build a new outfitter to build a relationship with an existing outfitter to maybe work out a deal. They don't have to have possibly deep pockets to purchase. They can lease some days, see if that's even what they really want to do before they would spend all this money. I just think it gives options. I don't know if that's what people are going to do, but at least it gives the freedom for both parties to work together to make a decision. And I also think one thing we see on the BH2 is the underuse of allocated days. And I think maybe, I don't know if this is true, I think this easy transferability would help us maximize those allocated days so that commercial operators are able to work to their full ability and also sustain the economy, healthy economy in Ennis as well.
Excellent. Good points.
And does the 2007 BLM agreement have an expiration date?
It is sort of in continuous unless the parties give like, I think, 6-month notice to terminate it. But at least our discussions have not been any desire to not have that continue for the managing the access, which is a mixture of state and federal properties. So our thought was to keep it in place. It's a reporting vehicle under which the state operates. The state collects the funds and uses the funds for the FAS support and other things. So we would see the SRP as staying as a tool. New outfitters could get an SRP, but to actually guide on the river, they would need the river use permit, either historically granted or acquired, lease or transferred, purchased. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And how about the other one, no matter how remote this might be, but let's just say the Montana River Legacy Act were to pass and these portions of the river were to become.
I have no idea.
You didn't have a look at that.
No, we didn't.
Okay.
There is, so there's a lot of flexibility on the federal side as well. And Chris McGrath, if you can hear me, feel free to jump in. But when you look at the language related to wild scenic rivers, and I forget the gentleman's name that you kind of spoke to this, but there's typically cooperative agreements with federal permitting as well. And so often in wild and scenic, you still have mixed land ownership, and there often is interagency cooperation. And so usually, likely what would happen is if there's something that's working, that would be a likely default or a starting place if wild and scenic.
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty accurate capture there, Brian.
Zach, did that give you sufficient background? And okay. Maybe call the question.
So Mac, I saw you drafting this. Would you mind reading that?
Well, what I wrote was the motion to seek support to devise alternate, and I put in quotes, river use permit system that would allow for complete and full transfer of allocated individual use days.
Should we add partial transfer to imply that a full transfer may be interpreted as?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Well, I think you might want to add lease.
Yeah, lease or transfer.
But the word partial, I think, is important.
And if you wanted to just add at the very end, consistent with SB 275.
Charlie, it's still not clear to me, given the transfer of the FASs to the park side of things, that this might wind up in parks, not in
It is.
Fish and Wildlife Commission.
Not bad.
But we'll figure that out.
That's why we're throwing it
Yeah,
to the
we'll
higher
figure-
authorities.
We'll figure that out.
I mean, the reorganization was internal, and so from a staffing perspective, that's why you got me here. As far as authority, though, that has not changed, so the Fish and Wildlife Commission still has the same authority it's always had. And similar with the Parks and Outdoor Recreation Board, so that has not changed. What you're seeing as a change internally is that the programs now are under the new division. That helps.
Yeah.
And all those river rec arms are under Fish and Wildlife.
They are now. I'm just wondering if that's going to shift. And that's a Becky Doctor question.
It would require legislation.
Okay. All right. Okay, let's call the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
And Chris?
Oh, sorry, I said aye as well.
Okay, thanks. So we have unanimous of those who are. in attendance.
Just real quick, Jim Hart just called me. He is trying to connect. I told him just to start over, but I don't know if we have to allow him in or he can just join. So just in case that pops up.
He should be able to just join.
Okay, I'll text him and let him know. Okay.
He can also call.
With that, and appreciate the support for that. I think it's a critical foundational step based on what our discussions have led. Just item,
And just pause.
Yeah.
So Charlie, you and I will work with the legal staff on this.
and if there's anything I can do,
You
let
bet.
me know.
I think I suggest that what member of Menard suggested is smart. There is something in writing that we can responded, that will help. And I made my notes here, but just, that'd be a good way to offer.
Okay, great. Carry on.
Okay, item 2 is more of just a housekeeping detail, and this was, again, part of the process we started with, which was to get a clear understanding of the geographical scope of management of the Madison River. And I think it was a good educational tool for myself, not as an outfitter, and hopefully for other members of the work group here. But just to put this in perspective, you've got the headwaters of the Madison River in the park, which are governed by the Park Service, U.S. Department of Interior National Park Service. The boundary of the park waters, the river down to Hebgen Lake, from Hebgen Lake to Quake Lake, and then Quake Lake itself are, on the one hand, you have Montana regulation on the licenses and outfitter license and fishing regs, but the commercial access is governed under U.S. Forest Service permits and the limits that they have there. From Quake Lake to the mouth of the river going into Ennis Lake is one of the sections governed by the cooperative management agreement between BLM and FWP, the SRP process. You then have that same SRP process for maybe a mile of river from Ennis Dam down to the wilderness boundary. Ennis Lake is a bit of a no man's land for outfitting. No current regulatory scheme. Any trips out there are not reported under the SRP process. That just is what we've gathered. Then you have the wilderness section, which BLM governs, who can operate commercial outfitting there. And then again, you pick up from the, what would it be, the northern boundary of the wilderness area coming out of Bear Trap Canyon for the remainder of the river to the Jefferson Junction, which falls back under the joint BLM FWP SRP process. Did I get that accurate?
Yeah.
So we just wanted to flag what we are talking about, which is really Quake Lake to Ennis Lake, and then below the dam down to the wilderness boundary, and from the wilderness boundary on the north end to the junction. That's what is currently governed there. We would, as I think Brian will eventually be coming back to our group here on the recreational, non-commercial side of future management. It may be a river-wide management system that needs to be placed, or a program and planning. One of the things we would probably recommend is that the agency or FWP commission figure out a way to at least gain information on the amount of outfitting that's taking place that may be on Ennis Lake or on the upper sections, which are governed by Forest Service. And that Forest Service is, the information is probably all out there, but it may become part of a whole river-wide adaptive management system. So I'm not recommending that there's action to be taken, but it might be something that the commission and staff want to just be thinking about. Anything to add from work group members, subgroup?
No, I think that was a thorough, adequate. We struggled a little bit in the subgroup with Ennis Lake, trying to figure out what's going on there, and also the section from Ennis Dam to the wilderness area is after talking, I guess we talked to Andrew Pulse, that's technically in the SRP and needs to be recorded.
Right, we're not sure that that's fully broadly understood by everyone, but that's our understanding that we've gained.
And I think another, just a touch of clarification, when Dan said no man's land, he meant that it doesn't fall under the SRP as necessary to be recorded as a trip.
It's not defined as the Madison River, it's defined as its own definition.
Right.
when you fish Ennis Lake?
Correct.
And is it a meaningful portion of the outfitting business?
I think so.
You do think so?
Well, it's important, but it's not, like, volume wise, it's not a high
Right.
volume relative to the commercial trips operated on the river. But it is meaningful, we do outfit on the lake.
And it's increased over my years of there, particularly at the mouth of the river coming in. It's great gulper fishing.
I guess what helped me understand why the gap exists between the dam and the wilderness boundary. Because
There's not a gap. It's just that once you get to, that is part of the SRP.
okay, so if you're doing a commercial trip there, that's recorded.
It is.
Right. There's no boat launch there, so you're not floating it. It's a walkway. Sort
It's
of.
not very heavily used because
Yeah.
it's a short amount of water.
And the boat launch is in the wilderness.
No.
It's
It's
just
right at the
outside,
top.
but to be able to go through there, you have to have a wilderness, one of the
Correct,
BLM
right.
permits, and there's 2 outfitters. So just something for future thinking.
Allison, is there any, I mean, not that we have to conquer this today, but any thought process that moving forward, there should be data recorded for outfitted trips on the lake, just so we get an idea of what's going on there? Maybe, I don't know if
That's
that's
our
a can of worms you
recommendation.
want to open, but just throwing that out there.
Allison, that's our recommendation, is that FWP devise some system to gather that information for future reference.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a challenge because the lake is not part of the SRP. So to have Fish, Wildlife and Parks request, hey, are you guys fishing the lake? It's none of their business at this time. And that was a lot of, recording to when we did SB 275, what's necessary, reporting to the Board of Outfitters, what's necessary, should we do it under FWP? It's gonna be, there's an issue there.
It's an important topic to address on a statewide level, looking at the growth of recreation and the concerns with that on many other rivers. But we should look at that well beyond Ennis Lake. It should be, should we have a data collection receptacle for tier 1 rivers, right? That may need recreation management plan at some point.
I'm not arguing that we need that information. I'm saying that acquiring that information is going to be a challenge in this process and also legally. And I'll give you the excellent example was Upper Bitterroot, West Fork. When that permit went into effect, they did not permit a large section of the Bitterroot River. And the river managers on the Bitterroot, Christine O'Shell, approached the outfitters and said, hey, it'd be nice if we had your river use on the river, that section that isn't permitted. And it never happened. They were like, no, it's none of your business. We don't need to give you that information. So I'm saying we can request use on the lake. It's not part of the SRP system now.
And I don't think we wanted to go down this rabbit hole for purposes of what we're addressing. It was educational to identify it as an area. And I don't think we're trying to make a judgment call of how the reporting would take place, but if you had, like, in a future river-wide adaptive management plan, you're going to need that information, not only on this river, but if this becomes a template for the Yellowstone, for the Missouri and other rivers that are experiencing growth in usage. And how you do that, higher pay grade than we're at.
And if I may, I'd suggest that we table that for now and not go back to the department with, request. Let's get these bigger issues.
Yeah, and this is one more of just, you can put this aside,
Okay.
but it's probably something that internally needs to be thought about in the future. And Mac,
If I could, so what informed my discussions and thoughts on this part of it was apply, for better, lack of a better term, the river use permit system to those areas that are currently under SRP. Crystal clear, clean, and we're data driven. This is where we've been reporting. This is what we've been doing. Now, downrange, there may be a need. And so I think that captures essentially what our logic was. But it was very important for us to have the conversation about what the geographic limitations and application was going to be, an agreement on where the rest of the plan gets built. So that's foundational.
And just to add to that is that this river section reach definition was defined in 2007 when the agreement between the state and the feds to incorporate the SRP or implement the SRP came into effect.
and if that potentially even could be amended. I'm not suggesting that, but if they wanted to amend the reach of the SRP.
That's an easy way to draft our outline, or our position statement on that, is we just reference in addition to what we have, but we reference the 2007
Cite it.
agreement language.
Right.
Didn't
Just
know
cite
that.
it.
That's good. Yeah.
What about this next point?
Okay, you got one good.
The number 3 is really I think a fairly minor clarification, but it was something that came up of questions of if you
It's mine
did,
now.
how if you did 2 laps on a section, or you did half-day trip with one party and a half-day trip with another party. What is the definition that's applied? Brian, you're probably far more knowledgeable than I am on this one, so.
Yeah, well, the way we've chosen to define it is if you've got the same 2 clients, however you spend the day, that's a trip. Even if you launch, some outfitters will, for example, launch at Story Ditch early in the morning. It's they'll get way out ahead of everybody else, take out, and they'll run up the Lions Bridge where everybody's now down, and they'll finish their day, but that's still one trip, even though they go to 2 different places. However, if you took 2 parties out in the morning, came back and had 2 other clients in the afternoon, that's a separate trip. So you actually ran 2 trips the same day.
Right.
And there's another big distinction in that the BH2 quantified their quantity of use based on the angler day or the client day. So if you had 2 people in your boat, that was 2 trips or 2 days. And so BH2 is allocated based on that, the client day. And when the 2018 EA from Fish, Wildlife and Park came out, they said, well, you can have 1 or 2 people, sometimes 3 people in your boat, but it's the unit of measurement is the boat going down, and so that's a trip. And that's the distinction why we needed to define guided trip way back when we were petitioning the commission, that there's a real distinction between client days and trips.
Mike, is this different than the current SRP or the same?
No, this is the same as the SRP.
And I don't think any action is suggested at this point in time. It's more of a setting the groundwork for discussions.
So the RUP would be based on this.
That's right. Yeah,
Got it.
very similar.
At some point, we may want to consider, once there is a restricted nature, can one licensed guide take 30 people fishing on a wade trip with several helpers?
Right,
Oh,
that's where we got into.
We got into some
Because it went
what
to
ifs.
the walkway trips in the upper river or walkway trips in the lower river, and you're taking 5 clients, 1 guide to 5 clients, or technically under the SRP, that's 1 trip. If you did it on the Beaverhead or Big Hole, it'd be 5 days.
So we may want to have like a maximum of 3 clients to guide or some kind, if you're gonna. have-
But we haven't
or four,
defined that. That's never been defined in the SRP. It's always been defined as one guide
One
for
guide.
however many clients.
I think
So
that
changing
part,
it now, changing horses.
We may want to
race.
have like an adaptive, maybe that's something you address.
Something to look at.
And again, I would suggest this is one of the rabbit holes that we can go down, and it'd be more appropriate as we've really worked through many of the bigger issues. This one might come back in a month or two
I hope not.
to us.
You kind of need to work with the data you got. And that's what we've got here. I think there was general agreement among everybody on the subcommittee that a more precise measure of effort would be better. The Angler Day is a better unit of measure, but we don't have it.
No, we do have it.
Well, then
It's available. It was
But-
decided early on in
that it would be by the
2018
trip.
that the quantity was the trip.
Right.
And really why we came up with this definition is because people were comparing BH2 at the time with Madison.
Yeah,
Going, oh, they're doing 4,500 days on the Big Hole and 16,000 trips on the Madison. It's like, well, they're apples and oranges, sort of.
but I do think working with the data we got was the
Yeah,
driving
yeah.
piece. And I would have been, we're gonna find out that this level of fuzz causes us to have to do something else. If it was actually in Angler Days, you wouldn't have to do that.
And the current arm is defined as trips.
Yeah. We know that doesn't matter.
Including this weight fishing.
Yeah.
And there's also some good reasons for that as well, like 2 boats with a single angler is much more impactful than 1 boat with 2 anglers, right?
Right.
In terms of like just what it feels like on the river, so.
Right.
We do a lot of float fishing on the Madison River, and the watercraft is the most impactful part of it, whether
Yep.
there's 1, 2, or 3 people. in it.
Right.
Okay, now we get into the real meat of the discussion, which is item 4 here. And as we approach this, we tried to sort of step back almost to a foundational questions of the management objectives and the consequences of that. And analyze what we're trying to accomplish, both from the river perspective, the user perspective, and how it may vary. So the first option here, and these are not listed in any order, and they're not in a position that we're making a recommendation of one or the other. We're still in that informative phase and discussion phase. But the first one is, in some ways, you would say it's the application of the 2020 ARM, river-wide annual management. No geographical restrictions, no seasonality. And what do we mean by that? That would mean basically what the commission did in 2020 was they took historical SRP usage in 2019 and 20, aggregated the best of those numbers, which is roughly 16,200 trips. And regardless of when those trips were used, whether it was in July and August at the peak of river usage, or if it was in November or March, they are all the same. Similarly, whether they were used on the upper river, which by upper river, we basically mean above the bear trap, and the lower river below the bear trap. You could go back and forth to one section or another. So that's it's very straightforward, sort of simple, total flexibility there. As we pointed out, though, we start having some questions that needed to be explored. If your intent or your primary concern is crowding at a certain point in a certain period of time, does this address that issue, or does it allow potentially that issue to grow in one form or another. Not trying to draw conclusions there, but if you look at the charts that are at the back of this report, you'll see riverwide, it's, if you apply this 16,200, it's pretty much of a bell curve with peak in July and August. On the other hand, if you look at the upper river alone, it's very much, it's 85, 88% of the usage, historical usage, and it's a traditional bell curve. The lower Madison, which is maybe 12% of total historical usage.
Less, it's 8 point.
You ran the recent numbers. It's a bimodal graph.
Good.
I
Good,
call
lawyer.
it a double.
You called it a double humper.
But it peaks, it goes up in the May and June, drops precipitously for July and August, and at the end of August rises back up, and you have increased usage at the end of August through September, and then dropping off. So a very different look. So that takes us to sort of the questions there that we wanted to put out onto our subgroup and then out to the larger group of what would be the implications, pros and cons of first looking at a seasonality. And early at one of our very first work group meetings here, we defined peak season as basically June 15th to September 30th. And again, you look at the chart there for historical usage, that's pretty much the peak period there. You can argue going a little bit earlier in June, you can go another week into October, but let's, for most of our discussion purposes, stay with June 15th to September 30th. That captures on about 14,250s, 88% of the trips fall into that historical period of time. So one option here would be that you create within that 16,200 allocation, you defined the historical usage of a peak period, 14,200 some trips, whatever the numbers end up working out. And Brian's got them even more specific here that came out this afternoon that vary just slightly off of these. And that would be your maximum usage in the peak period. And does that help address the potential of even more growth in the summer peak period, primarily on the upper river? A variation of, then you get into two, or at least two, maybe more, subpoints if you had a seasonality, and that is, what do you do with the off-peak season definition, spring and fall? And we have identified at least two options. One would be that you allow the commercial usage could grow organically during that period of time to some, whether it's a cap or a trigger. I don't think any of our subgroup was promoting an unlimited, that it could just grow and never be regulated, but rather either we've had discussions of setting a percentage, setting a numerical number, or setting triggers that would come to play at some point and creating a new cap in the shoulder periods. Another variation, a second one, would be, no, you stay with the 16,200 capped days. You've defined the peak season so that 12 or 14,000 is in the peak season, and no more can come into the peak season. Shoulder seasons are out there. You could either use your historical shoulder season days, or if you don't use a peak season days, you could use it in the shoulder, but you've capped river-wide, season-wide at that cap, but you have a seasonal cap in between. So that's an option. And then the third area was to at least raise the questions for us of whether or not we treat the commercial cap as a river-wide cap, or do you look at it from a geographical usage, and the lower river and the upper river having very different use patterns in them? Does that justify a different regulatory scheme or a limitation? And we've laid out a variety of the different numbers that fall into there. The last 3 pages of this report are an attempt to lay out some of the pros and cons that we've discussed as a subgroup for each of those items. And I wasn't going to necessarily delve into all of those, but there are arguments on both sides, if you want to say, or as we're fleshing this out, that we can get into. So maybe before I go further, to make sure that we have some understanding here, and again, I'm directing this really towards the non-subgroup members here. Questions, concerns regarding these 3 concepts?
Like I said, it's more of a legal question. So if certainly anytime you allow it to go over the 16,173, that's going to take an arm change. If you cap it at 16,173, but allow a separate permit for the entire year and a separate one for the shoulder, but cap the total of those 2 types of permits at 16,173, does that need an arm change?
I think to create a new permit, you're doing an arm or something. I personally think whether you say the arm from 2020, that little provision is kept intact or not, you're going out to the public with all these different things, and it's.
Well, the intent of the current arm is to limit outfitters to the amount of trips they operated in an entire season. That's 60,173. So that current intent ends up being 16,173. And to ask for more in the shoulder seasons would be a significant change to that arm. Other details, for example, do you want to not allow these trips to move in here, but keep it under 160,000? That's a detail that would be added below without changing that intent, right? So I think the big question everybody has is, should we change the intent of the existing arm in terms of the capacity established, or leave that capacity established at 16,173 trips?
And explain what a change would entail on these other numbers, even if they're rough, recognized.
Yeah, and I think so. When we look at this, the one that doesn't change intent is B, option 1, right? That's the one that is essentially allowing growth in the shoulders. And I would agree that important part of that ask is how much should that growth be if that is the preferred option.
And it does raise more questions as we got in further of how you would manage future growth and what a trigger or future cap would be. It makes it a little bit more complicated. There's no doubt about that.
I think there's another strategy, or at least a parallel strategy, is keeping the existing arm in place and in developing new rules that work off of that arm. For example, you could, without having to repeal or revise the existing arm, you could talk about peak season triggers that apply to the existing limit, or you can can develop another rule that refers back to the existing rule, which is quite a bit easier, I think. I appreciate the changing an arm is challenging. It's going to be a challenge, especially if we have to do it with asking for more days.
You know, being the commissioner in the room, I'd say we're already going to be modifying this arm if you want to transfer these days.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. But I mean, today, none of the SRP rights that the outfitters own are transferable. So, and I don't, that's going to go out for public comment. So I think this group, I think the intent of the group really, when the commission created the work group, was to look at specific issues like this, the level of detail that they weren't prepared to get into in their meeting in December.
Just so I understand the B option 2, that would keep the total number of trips at 16,173.
That would be one of the options. You could, in essence, apply that annual cap, but you've created a subcap of seasonality.
Right.
If one of your concerns is that over time, economics or whatever may drive more usage into that July, August time period, which just a river-wide, no seasonality, no geographical limitations, it could happen. There may be reasons why it doesn't, but it could. Applying a seasonal internal cap would limit that growth. And then the shoulders could fluctuate either with their historical usage or non-usage from the peak time could be used in the shoulders.
But I think what Rich is asking is, would that total shoulder season be able to grow? And I guess the answer is no.
You're right. You're capping it.
It grows under option 1. It doesn't grow under.
It has. Yeah, that's right.
And
And
total use.
And to clarify, it is possible that the shoulders could grow without repealing the intent of the current arm. If you had a subcap that didn't allow the peak to grow, but if those days were allowed to go to the shoulders, your shoulders could still grow while remaining under 16,173. They would grow at the expense of the peak reducing.
right. And just this is a question that has come up with implications both for new outfitters coming onto the river, how or could they gain entry into it? And there's been some discussion that a less capped shoulder would be an opportunity to come in, gain experience. The other part of it is from some of the businesses that want to be able to grow in the Anna's community, and shoulders are the opportunity to grow, not the summers that are already maxed out. So those are some of the motivating factors. John, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You've helped put together some of our information here on the seasonality issue. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, Dan, thanks for including me, just listening in. For me, peak season triggers is a non-starter. I think what we've all agreed as an outfitting community is what we saw on the river between June 15th and October 1 in 2021 was too much traffic. We've all agreed to that, and we've agreed to that in as meaningful a way to go back in time to outfitters to take their best years of 2019 or 2020, and a vast majority of outfitters are tightening the belt buckle and taking a haircut because they feel it's the right thing. So to even use the word peak season triggers, we've already defined, we don't want one more day in the peak season. The outfitting community has spoken. So take peak season triggers off the table, in my opinion. The major issue to me in the existing arm, and there's so many positive things about it, the major issue is that that I believe was overlooked is, let's use round numbers, or 16,000 trips in that outfitters can use for their best year in 19 or 20, and there's 12,000 trips that so you do the math. There's 4,000 trips in the peak season, that when people start selling these days with fluidity, one day at a time, and outfitters start selling days, that it may not happen overnight, but the opportunity exists for 4,000 days to come into the peak season on the upper river, and it just can't happen. So whatever we end up doing, we have to amend the existing rule so that these trips that are in the shoulder seasons cannot pile into the peak season. And I don't believe that we're actually asking for more trips in the shoulder season. I think time will tell on that. And I think things like high water and weather and options of other places to go fishing during the spring and fall are what keep present caps on the shoulder season. So, I'm pro seasonality, but I also like a lot of the things that are in the present arm, and I am a big proponent of capping peak season and going back to 19 and 20. Well, that's kind of where I stand. But thank you very much for including me.
Along these lines, there's an option that I think we just kind of glossed over, and that's the first option, which is river-wide annual management. That's in the existing rule, and here we are 2 years after it was put into place, and we haven't looked at it. What if we implement that rule? And part of our charge too is develop evaluation plans and see what happens with shoulder seasons within the existing arm. See what happens with the peak season within the existing arm. See how these transferability issues happen within the existing arm. It was, you might not remember, Dan, but it was quite a battle even to get that existing arm in place. And the fight, if John Sampson will remember this, was getting the 2020 days included in that. And to just, steamroll over the existing arm and just go right to trying to develop more scenarios that we haven't even looked at what happens.
Well, I take issue with your assumption there that we're just rolling over the existing arm. That is sort of the default position that we start with. But going back a little bit to what I think as a group we are charged with is to look at the implications of things as well as options for this. And that's why exploring the geographical question, the seasonality question is relevant. And I think I've heard it from you directly, Mike, at times. It's not easy to take something away from somebody if you're talking about, well, we'll look at it in 3 or 5 years and 1,000 days have moved into the peak season. That's not easy to take it away. So let's at least have the discussion now where we explore what the implications are. And I think we just need to have that healthy discussion. But it's not at the expense of, that might be where we end up.
And just for transparency and making sure everybody recognizes, when we talk historically of cumulative use that occurred in 19 of it and cumulative number of trips that occurred in 20, when we use the festive approach, that's more trips than occurred in either one of those years. So
by how much?
15.6% higher than the 19 level and 26% higher in 2020.
Brian, after our meeting tonight, could you have them post on our teams your latest
that was really
breakdown?
Good that was really good.
There.
And then the other thing, just for everybody to understand, is shoulder seasons. The fall shoulder season in 2013, there were 411 trips. The best of window would be 1,336 strips, so it's 225% growth in about 7 years. So we do need to recognize shoulders have grown, in some cases tripling in 7 years.
Well, they went from nothing to something.
So the like to just magically stay flat. So to your point, if we do ask for more growth, we need to recognize that potential growth is probably going to happen. So we need to.
And that's where we've had some discussions. If we were to have a shoulder season growth opportunity, what the nature of some of those triggers are. Percentages when you're operating off of 10 trips in a week in the fall, 20 trips might look like 100% growth, but if you compare that to capacity or the trips in the middle of the season. So percentages, we kind of, that might not be the right way to approach it, but there could be other caps or triggers that could come to play. Because the usage in the shoulder seasons, the non-peak usage is about 25%, I think.
It's 20. It's actually like 18.5%.
Okay.
I think to follow on Brian's point, it's important too to note that although, or in conjunction with the growth of 400% in the shoulder seasons over the last 7 years, use on the Madison in the last 10 years, commercial use doubled. So the peak doubled in the time that it took for the shoulders to grow by 400%. And I think that's why we're here, right? Is not to develop a growth management plan for the river going forward, but to develop a recreation plan that sustains, important use into the future.
And one of your points there, the reason I think we've all come here is that growth in the peak period. That's huge growth. The comments that I hear all the time, we don't want to have July and August like we had last year and various things. And that's been the driver of a lot of our discussions. And that's at least an element of why we raised the question about seasonality and geographical, to make
Right.
sure that we're looking at it in the right manner.
And that follows my point. If growth in the peak doubled in 10 years, but growth in the shoulder increased by 400%, which is 4 times the amount.
But the numbers
Why are we-
are, you increased by 900 days versus you increased by 6,000 days.
Yeah, it went from nothing to something. So what?
So
Dan?
I'll give you so what, Mac. I mean, I don't understand the politics between different commercial users, candidly. Like what you guys are operating on a level of politics that's over my head, because I don't have any commercial interest in this industry or any experience working in it. But the so what is that the shoulder seasons are a refuge for locals and fish. And it's a chance to use the river when you don't have to play bumper boats. And it's a chance to go fishing and maybe be the only other person you see on the river. And it's a chance for the fish to spawn and have cold water and bugs available. And so that's the so what from my perspective. And so I guess I would offer that most of the public will not understand. I don't understand the multiple cap conversation, how you push the balloon down over here and it expands over here. That's over most people's heads. What most people will latch onto is the fact that you set numbers in ARM within the last couple of years that set a commercial cap. And if we're coming back and moving the ball with this recommendation that this group ultimately makes to the commission, I would posit that won't be super well received by Joe public. So I think we ought to be respectful of that reality, or at least aware of it. And also if we ultimately propose a plan that insinuates growth on the shoulder seasons, we should recognize that, yeah, there is a tangible impact on the resource and many of the people who live here but don't make a living off of it.
Dan, if I could, and I'd like to share some thoughts in a more basic level about these options, particularly with my fellow committee members. So when I look at river-wide, no seasonality, that basically is modeled after what grew organically. Without a lot of limitation or a lot of outside influence, that's basically what emerged in a sort of a natural demand supply system. And so fundamentally, any changes that you make to that would necessarily be pushing the balloon here, it's going to bulge somewhere else. So that's kind of rattles around in my head. We know what the level is. It's 19 and 20. We know that it's upper and it's lower. We know that it's bimodal in the lower, and we know that it's peaked in the upper. Okay, all of those things exist because that was the natural tendency in the fishery. So that's one element. The concern on that one that resonated with me anyway was, okay, fine, we allocate it flat out that way. And what happens when days that were accumulated in those shoulders migrate into the peak? So for the very reason that you were, expressed your concern about growing here, they could easily migrate into here and grow that. And so that was, that's a thought, that's a question. Then when we got into the idea of peak versus non-peak, I mean, the reality is that the thing that brought us here was what happens between June 15th and the end of September in the upper river. I mean, that's what started it. And in our efforts to be complete, be forward thinking, we've started to parse those pieces apart. So it made sense, to have that conversation about upper and lower. The complication became the scale, the magnitude of it. The complication became people built models around it that had grown organically. But probably the more important part of it was when we started to talk about peak versus not peak. And that argument or that approach made a tremendous amount of sense if you were only talking about the upper river. Because the moment you go down into the lower river, you have two peaks. And we had the conversation about the complexity of managing this system when we're done, because we only want one bucket to have to allocate out of. We don't want three: peak use in the upper, early peak, late peak in the lower. I mean, you could see how complicated that could be. And so these were the elements that sort of we centered a lot of discussion. And Zach, you're absolutely right that this can get, the moment we start going to, decimal points on percentages and that, but conceptually, it's really those three models that are there. The decision points boil down to this: do we go full season, full river? Do we apply it in a peak mentality? Or do we apply it to a seasonal and peak? I mean, a geographic and peak mentality. So over the last month, and we've all known this, that those have bubbled up. Those are the decision points. And once we get past those, the rest of it's gonna flow, I think, pretty well. So I just wanted to put it in those terms without a whole lot of complication. There are more pros and cons and considerations than I brought up, but you get the picture. Those were the things that we grabbed onto and the way we kind of approached them.
And then we tried to share the last 3 pages of this to a large extent are summarizing some of the considerations, pros, cons, you could call it, on each of these different interpretations. And as a group, we have not said or had the final debate or called the question of which one do you support. We're rather exploring it. And my approach in doing this was, let's flesh it out. Let's really have these discussions and identify the the issues so that not just the commercial group here that would be living with this, but others, users of the river, the fisheries management people. Let's get your thoughts and opinions. So that's really important for us to probably go back to our next round of discussions.
If I could jump in and I'll keep my mouth shut.
No, we really want you to be talking.
Well, one other thought, I shared this with Brian.
Oh,
before, but-
sorry to interrupt. Zach,
Can we move the speaker or the,
Oh, good idea.
Yeah.
maybe get it over here?
Sorry.
because you have lots to offer. I want to hear.
Thanks, Charlie.
I guess,
Just move it right up here by Zach.
well, hopefully it won't be talking much after this. Thank you. So I guess I just want to share that I think it's also important at this stage to consider the fact that that one of the other tasks of this group is thinking about non-commercial regulatory frameworks, right? And at some point, we're going to have to move forward with both of those proposals. And as a public representative and a non-commercial user of the river, that conversation is of particular interest to me. And I think is not going to be an automatic, easy sell to the public, especially in Montana with our culture and history of attachment to natural resources and fishing and river use and whatnot. And so I think with this conversation about setting up or manipulating or relooking at the commercial regulatory framework, we need to be sensitive to the fact that if we're moving the goalposts in that conversation, it may very well affect public perception of whether we're able to sell the non-commercial regulatory framework. They're related from my perspective.
Yeah, maybe two observations. One was, we've had some discussions that we did feel it was fairly important to move forward on the commercial regulatory scheme, which is more doable sooner than the options on the non-commercial side are going to take more time, in part to set the example and take the lead. The second observation is, in some ways, the discussion about seasonality is a reduction by the commercial group of what could happen in the peak season. As like Mac pointed out, you could have theoretically a migration of 4,000 days into the peak that could be limited depending upon how you look at it, so that you're capping the commercial usage at a lower threshold during that peak season. So it's actually, depending upon how you look at it, there can be positives from a non-commercial user's perspective as well.
And just I've had a lot of conversations in the community on the non-commercial topic, and really trying to gauge what's the appetite from folks that, especially folks that don't have a vested interest in the tourism industry. And surprisingly, there's fairly high interest and recognition that something needs to be done. And I think appetite for a collective solution. I frequently get asked what will happen to commercial. So I think it's a astute observation that once we have clarity on whatever that plan may be, that will aid in the conversation of non-guided users and their participation.
And right, wrong, or indifferent, commercial users blame non-commercial users for river crowding, and non-commercial users blame commercial users for crowding, right? So they're intertwined, and it's not that none of that is scientific. That's biased and perspective, but we should be sensitive to the other side of the coin when we're talking about commercial or non-commercial. Sorry, Mike.
I just want to build on two things. One is Mac's points of this bell-shaped curve and bimodal curve in the lower river was in fact built organically. And it's important to point out it was built under no restrictions, no limits. And that's the curve that came out. But I'm also gonna use your words that we talked about in, say, 2020, when you said, the best first step is we gotta put a core group on. And I think that's what's going on. The thing we haven't been talking about is the resource, right? I mean, ultimately, I think we're here to, protect or sustain and maintain the resource into the future as well. And when you're talking a 400% growth in shoulders over 7 years, which is twice the rate that the peak grew,
Not quite that high, but
is also.
it's 300, about 300% the fall. Yeah.
Is that in the shoulders is the spawning season for browns and rainbows. And so we're talking about a growth management plan for outfitters to grow their business or whatever in a time of the year when you probably don't want to be growing at that particular time of the year on those particular portions of it. And there's a reason those numbers are historically lower than the peak organically.
And we flagged some of those as weather, river conditions, competing golf
And
tournaments.
there's also,
whatever.
outfitter capacity within, the system itself. I think is a limit that, kind of gloss over that. Probably growing the peak by 4,000 trips in July is unrealistic given the amount of outfitting capacity, guiding capacity we have currently.
Just bring up another one, Dan.
Yeah.
The important charge of this work group is, creating a process to permit new outfitters on the Madison River. I guess one positive, setting aside the concern about spawning fish, one positive about leaving the shoulders with some growth opportunities, that helps with the topic that Allison's working on.
Yeah, and that was one of the areas that we flagged, that it would be an opportunity for new people to grow in there. If I could, maybe move for a second here from item 4 and go into the first couple of technical questions on page 3, items 5, because they tie in a little bit with the implications for new outfitters. The first part, A, is just, this goes back to what we started our discussion with, is as simplified of a transfer or lease program of use days that would be a critical element for smooth operation of businesses, growth up and down of outfitter activity, mid-season. If somebody needs to lease 10 more days, they could somehow do that. And I think there was a comparison given out of your hunting use days of an online system that's been devised.
Oh, for the NCHU, net hunting client use, yeah. So the model exists where you're obligated to have a NCHU for each client served under a big game license if you're operating on private land. And the acquisition of those were granted, years ago. They were sold by the state. Some people ended up with tens of thousands of dollars of investment in NCHU. It now really has little application, a lot of NCHU out there. So the board of outfitters turned it into something that could be very easily transferred. Administratively, the process is very simple.
And this is more of going to administration. You'd still have the economics between one user and another to work out. But that's a critical element perhaps for new outfitters coming into the river or for those that are growing their business. But a second thing that we've spent a fair amount of vigorous debate over within our group is item B. What are the implications of an outfitter's non-use of allocated days or trips? And we've had a total free market system where, well, you'd be a fool if you didn't use them or transfer them. So we don't need to do anything to concerns that, well, somebody could be just pocketing days, or somebody could come in and purchase an outfitter and lots of days with no intent to use them, but just to, they don't want people floating by in front of their property or something. So I've got billions of dollars and I can take them off the market. And that has an impact on the businesses, community, and recreational opportunities. So we've gone back and forth of, should there be some sort of a use it or lose it provision? And if so, what might that look like? Is it over a 3 or 5 year period? Would those days that may be forfeited or reduced from non-usage become available for a pool that could be, basically be replenishing a new outfitter pool? And then get into all the questions of how do you allocate those days into new ones. But that basic philosophical question of use it or lose it, or do you just, total free market would be something for our group to discuss further and give us some insights. Did I kind of summarize?
Yeah, and just to, I'll add a few thoughts there. So going to the Big Hole Beaverhead, where there's some outfitters that have access to 200 peak season trips in that ration season, and maybe only operating 30. There's no mechanism in place to, there's no performance metric, and there's no way for them to give those trips away. There's also no way, they're truly a property right in that sense. And so the idea of having some performance metric, the idea is, okay, we're done growing, we've got limits, but if we decline in use, we shouldn't be able to continue to lock up these trips. They should be able to eventually be allowed for another outfitter to either grow or a new entrant to come in. I think if we are allowed to lease trips, we need to be aware that it would be possible for an aging outfitter to just go into the rental business. If there's no performance, they could operate 0 trips,
but the days would still be available,
and they could just lease their trips for 20 years into the future and operate.
And if I recall
0.
correctly, the Arkansas River system, when that was presented to us, it was a use it, loan it, or lose it provision.
You do, correct.
And by loan it, do you mean lease?
Yes.
Lease.
Yeah, so you'd allow somebody else to use your day.
So, no one should lose their access to trips if at some point in the future they expect to operate back to those historic levels. I think the concern is, what about the person that's just sort of coasting into retirement but still operating at a lower level? Maybe they ran 400 trips when they're at their peak, and now they're running 50 trips. What happens to those other 350 trips?
And there could be thresholds of, examining every 3 to 5 years of, if you're not using at least, whether it's 75, 80% have been some of the numbers thrown around of your days.
You just want to be careful that there's a lot of outfitters that aren't in the Madison Valley that periodically come to the Madison, and their visitation changes abruptly from year to year. And that's a very valid business model as well. And so you don't want to encourage someone to come to the Madison just so they validate their permit. You want them to truly come when they need to come. Maybe it's a low water year somewhere or a high water year somewhere, or they've got some special clients that want variety. So if you're going to have a trigger, that you want to have it over enough years that you're not excessively punitive.
Mike? There's an important point to understand this discussion on this opportunity for entry and use it or lose it, in that these ideas were talked about under the Madison Rec Plan based on issues from BH2, where the opportunity for entry on the BH2 dried up. There is none right now. And it also, these discussions also, and sort of methods and techniques of both of these happened prior to SB 275, where transferability suddenly on Madison now becomes a fluid, more open market. So when we talk about, 80% performance values, we're used to be thinking about these days on the payroll that probably aren't necessarily going to apply in Madison going forward. And also opportunity for entry, if it's, opportunity for leasing days or buying days or working with an outfitter that you're going to take over their business at some point. That makes it a little bit easier to talk about these mechanisms that we're discussing.
What do you think the lease rate would be?
I have no idea. It's never been this type of model under these transferability new laws. It never happened before. And they're protected on the BH2, totally different system on the Upper Beta Route West Fork. Let's implement it for look at it. We still have 2.5 years on this.
And there'll probably be some people that make good decisions on what lease rates are and some that make bad choices.
And how, I appreciate all the work that the subgroup's already done, but it helped me understand the process moving forward. So if we want to take a proposal to the commission on the June 23rd meeting, I really need to have that by early June. So say our May meeting, I can buy delaying on the non-commercial rec proposal until the August meeting, right? We all just, I mean, I think that could go right along with this one for the June meeting if we could be prepared. But the one I really don't think we should separate is the plan for new entrants and what we do on the
Right.
cap.
And just, we'll get Allison.
I just don't want to go to the commission empty-handed.
Right.
On that.
And I don't mean to take away, we'll get Allison in here to do it, but we've had some discussions that, and you've seen some of Allison's material there, but until we probably make some or more firm decisions of what the cap looks like, that will drive some of Allison's discussions. And we've actually talked about Allison, why she sat in with us is it's probably makes more sense to just roll it all together. And we would cascade it down as that's a critical element that would be coming here as part of the proposal.
So as the process unfolds, you see the subgroup bringing a firm proposal to the work group?
Well,
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's doable for us with the commitment of more time from everybody here over the next month to come back. I don't know whether it will be a single recommendation or that there are some variations.
Shouldn't we be able to engage the group on those? I mean, there's some key decisions.
Right.
And I personally think it is far more appropriate for us to say, okay, we've mapped them out for you, but we really need a vote.
Yeah.
We need your informed consent on the direction we're going to go.
And here's some clear scenarios.
Exactly.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's, I mean, in many ways, we're trying to spark that discussion right now for everybody else that you, without going through the battlefield that we've gone through over the last series of meetings, you can get a sense of these things, and we need your feedback.
In terms of new entry, the one where you keep the cap at 16,173, but you have two permits, one's good for the entire year and one's good for the shoulders. It would seem like that shoulder permit would be worthless, not worthless, but of less saleable value. So that it would be a way for a person to get in, so they could buy some shoulder permits, get their business going, eventually be able to buy some peak season ones.
I think the most important thing we need to establish, and probably need to do it as a collective group, whether it's today or at the next meeting, is whether to expand the pie or keep it at 16,173, because from that will descend what the options are for new entry, et cetera, right? So I think that's probably the number one most important thing and that probably should be done as collectively with that guidance, I think as subgroup, then we've got our lane or options or the sandbox we can play in.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. If I could just touch on before we leave the use it and lose it and enter into the I guess this is one that Mike and I think have had conversations on this and they're in alignment, but no matter what we do, when we set the cap and we allocate these days, we have monetized the permit or the use. There's no question about it. There's no pretending we didn't. We've created a value that didn't otherwise exist. And it is incredibly important that that value be able to be freely moved among qualified operators. I think from a state perspective, not an outfitter perspective, but a state policy perspective, I think what's going on in the Big Hole and Beaverhead is a travesty. There are many, many underutilized days that the guided angling public don't get to enjoy. And that's a mistake. So we want to avoid that. And the way we do that, we end up being able to freely trade days, back and forth. And so in terms of use it or lose it, I think it's kind of like when we think about those models that grew organically and the simplest is better, the less that we mess with it, the more likely it will find its place. And because we've monetized them, because there is easy transfer, I don't think days will go unutilized. And I think the pathway so use it or lose it could take the form of tracking past use, taking into account this infrequent utilization. It gets complicated. And then the issue becomes, how do you reallocate them? Who's in charge of that? Who gets to pick the winners and losers? That kind of thing, right? And so it seemed to me, this is one that I think I have centered on, and I'm throwing it out here. If I'm wrong, I'll be told. But I think the market will take care of use it or lose it. I think the market will take care of, I even think it will take care of the new entry.
And just to share, I think we've had a lot of consensus or sympathy towards a open free market system, with the caveat that free markets can be distorted. And the example is, if you had a wealthy billionaire or two that wanted to buy up days, could pay more than any outfitter would pay, and buys half that 16,000 days. It's a drop in the bucket for them, but they've just cut the outfitting going past their place in half, and it's impacted businesses up and down the river. How do we limit that? Or is that a risk?
And there's another, I have a lot of friends on the Arkansas River, which is mostly a rafting river, but you can lease days there. And there is frustration there because they can continue to validate their permits by just perpetual leasing trips. And I mean, maybe that's okay, but I think use it or lose it, no one's going to just relinquish their days, but it would add some pressure to transfer at some point if you drop below a certain threshold of operation. Especially if you have the carrot of I'll just be a landlord of trips the rest of my life. I don't have to plan guide schedules, or I can just put a price on them and lease them for the next 20 years. So that's my big concern. Without some performance metric you know, there could be some unintended conduct, you know, that's a good point too, Dan, and, you know, what are your thoughts on that, Mac, you know, on the perpetual leasing?
I don't have a problem with it, Brian. I mean, I appreciate your concern over it, but I guess guy buys an apartment, he rents the room. And if he chooses to do that as a way, my biggest concern from a public policy standpoint is that the industry has access to those days and the public has access to being served. I don't really care from a policy standpoint if you're in a perpetual leasing scenario. I do care that the public gets served and gets to enjoy the resource and that the industry has access to those days.
So the underlying assumption is that those days are continued to be used one way or another.
Yeah. And I think
they
the free
service-
market, when you monetize something, you make a value out of it. It'd be a damn fool to be not utilizing it, right?
Again, the example I give you is one of the free market where somebody has a different set of
But I
values.
think that's a reach, Dan. I really do. The billionaire coming in and
But
buying.
to
everything.
Dan's point,
Mac, I
I've
mean,
seen that occur at the Grand Canyon. There was a group that thought the Park Service was giving out too many camping permits. So, you know, they were nominal cost. And they went in and they got a bunch of permits and never used them. But I don't think that's a problem that's gonna have with something that's gonna be as expensive as a trip permit. So I guess I'm willing to take the risk of a billionaire coming in to just make it simple and let the, you know, people take care of themselves.
I mean, does anyone have a problem with Dan and the subgroup coming up with some language on non-use?
Yeah,
It seemed-
we talked about it. There were some points we talked about in previous models was, you know, you can't own more than 10% of the days. Who decides that, right? How do you work that? I don't know, where you can't own more than 2 permits. There was talk about that, and that was prior PhD type models. The other thing that's important is this idea of these other river recreation arm rules that can't have it be a property right. All the other state permit systems too have some language as to use it or lose it. I think it's a fallback. If you know, something's not working, the guy moves to Florida and just sits on his days. There's got to be a way to repeal that, perhaps. Following that is stuff we talked about. The other thing is, and this comes off of Brian, is it depends on the mechanism we incorporate. If we go under the existing arm rule and look at it for 2 years, we could, you know, that allows time to look at opportunity for entry. Do we need it? Do we not? Do we need? Because Mac and I talked about this a lot. Under the new transferability, do we really need use it or lose it? Well, market with all our discussion, probably not, except for this idea of
Property rights.
property right issues and the other arm rules. And then under that same discussion, do we need opportunity for entry? If it's organic across the year and the days are flowing and market system's happening, and the lease is available or a rent or an agreement with the existing outfitter, opportunity for entry is way easier than any other river system in the state. But we might want to have a, you know, the fallback mechanism that in case none of those work.
Yeah.
So I guess a question I'd throw out, first of all, nothing we're talking about is free market anything, because this is all a highly regulated thing. The whole discussion is about regulation, but
Yeah, within that system.
that's a little bit of a just semantics grumpy comment. But the question would be, is there a way, and maybe this is back to the group or to FWP attorneys, is there a way to create a regular adaptive management review mechanism that sort of keeps this conversation coming back in front of the commission on a recurring basis, so that if some wild scenario like that happens, you can deal with it, and instead of trying to design a regulation that sort of plans for every wild outcome.
Right, and one of the things we even threw out was that adaptive management plan and having some mechanism for issuance of new days if the usage just dropped off from people not using them for whatever, but there was otherwise demand, somebody was locking up the days.
You could have a minimum threshold trigger.
Could you reissue
evaluate.
some days? But then that raises the question, okay, how do you do that too? But
Zach,
that could be for
under-
another day.
Oh, sorry. Zach, under existing arm rules, even for the Madison, there is a rule, I can't find it right now, but that charges the commission with going back to review the Madison recreation plan. I think it's a 5 year. We were talking about 2 years in our discussions. Yeah, I think that's critical, and that's also critical for everything we come up with, right? The FAF program, the parking lot program, whatever. I think anything that comes from this work group should have some evaluation tied to it.
Well, with that, if there's a concrete satisfying way to ensure that the commission's looking at this on a recurring basis, I tend to agree with what Mac was describing, that the market just sort of washes out a lot of the nuances that we're worried about. Or at least if it doesn't, then you get to come back and try and deal with those.
12/11/67/11.
5 years.
And, you know, in the.
Shall review all these arm rules that we're coming up with.
One little new on the, you know, on BH2, there's still a relinquishment mechanism. It's you, if you operate 0 trips, I think it's 2 years in a row, you can lose your permit. So you could have something where if you're just not operating at all, 0 trips for probably not 2 years, but X number of years, that would eliminate the requirement to change the property right parts of the arm.
I'm not sure where we're leaving this, but I want to keep us on track.
Yeah.
And it's time for the break. So what I would say is I'm pretty comfortable pushing this one back to the subgroup for you guys to formulate some language, no later than the May meeting to take to the commission.
That's one we can come to figure out.
You bet.
Yep.
So let's regroup at 1:15.
Can you hear anything right now in the room? Question mark. I cannot.
Thank you, Charlie.
You bet.
All right, Dan, take care.
Hey, how was your time?
You know, you kind of. Take care, drive careful.
I neglected at the outset to introduce Charlie Sperry, who Eileen Rice is no longer going to be attending our meetings, and instead Charlie's going to be the representative from FWP. And Charlie, do you mind just saying a few words about your background with this topic and your role?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Charlie Sperry. Right now, I'm the assistant administrator for the new Parks and Outdoor Recreation Division at FWP. I got it. My very first job with FWP was I think the title was River Recreation Management Specialist, working out of the director's office, brand new position. So I've been through a lot of these discussions over the years since 2002 at Beaverhead, Big Hole, Madison, Alberton Gorge, Blackfoot. Yeah, plenty of so. But yeah, I'm just, my job and the agency's job is to provide some technical support, help to recall some of the history, explain and answer questions regarding rules like came up today. What you'll see me do, and which is really important, is we stay objective. We're not policy setters here, staff. We're here to just provide a service to this work group so they can do the best job possible, and I'll stay true to that. So glad to be of support to this group, and good to see a lot of familiar faces back and involved in this again.
Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie. So before we leave the last topic, Dan, I think the ideal case is for the subgroup to provide us a more firm proposal going forward, maybe at our April meeting. And I think for those who either aren't here or for folks who want to continue this dialogue, I really hope that you'll connect with Dan and give feedback directly for his subgroup. Yep.
And I think in order for the subgroup to go forward with the least amount of options out there, we got to make the decision tonight whether 16,173 is going to be the cap or not. Once we make that decision, then we can see how we're going to allocate that or what level of growth we would allow. We ought to make that decision tonight.
I guess. I mean, I think if we're working toward a commission meeting on June 23rd, I mean, my sense is we don't have a firm commitment on that right now.
I think.
And I guess where I also am is I really want Allison. I can't really go back to the commission without a plan for new outfitters and the cap. So I'd like you guys to sort it out.
I think what we're struggling with is things like outfitter entry all predicate on whether we're going to grow the pie or keep the pie as it's been agreed upon. So that's where we're hung up, to Rich's point. So I think we would benefit as a subgroup to have, and that one issue, which is the biggest issue, to get some clarity Because a lot of other decisions are predicated on that one.
Yeah, we just be pushing it down the next meeting. I mean, it's the elephant right in the middle of the room here. If we have, as a subgroup now, if we have direction on that, I think it's full speed ahead.
I mean, on, when we get, this starts getting into some of the details there, my recommendation would be to hold off on that. I think we have a sense, I'd still like to get as much input from the other members of the work group who may have not spoken up or are not here tonight, that we can bring back. I think more likely than not, we'll have a sense of a path as we get together as a subgroup here soon.
So you would vote no if we took a vote now?
I'd say I'm voting prematurely. I'd just as soon not do that right now.
Yeah, and I'd really like to see Allison get together with your group. Well, I don't know who is on Allison's subgroup, but I'd like to see you guys dialogue about new entries and how that's going to be resolved. You know, we've heard some ideas during the break.
Vote on it, I'd like to know what your opinion.
I think
Well-
it's stay the same.
Procedurally, though, if we have someone who's making a proposal to vote and it's back to vote, then we have some that are saying, no, I'm not gonna vote. What do we do? We should probably take a vote.
What is a work group, right? And we've got, what, 3 members who aren't here tonight. I'm not sure actually.
And we as a subgroup did not come into this meeting with the intent of making a firm recommendation.
I understand that, but if we have members of the subgroup saying, hey, give us direction, and it's their prerogative to say, here's your direction. I think procedurally, you have to vote. That's what the vote is, right? And yours would be no, yours would be yes, I would guess.
And just to satisfy Mike, I'm happy to entertain a motion.
Well, I think it's satisfying the group, it's not.
Well, it's not actually. We've heard dissenting opinions.
Yes, Brian, Mike, is it, I don't need a motion right now, because I want to know what Richard thinks. I want to know what Zach thinks, and I want to take that back and then have our conversation about it. And if we were to do something like that, I don't want to vote on a specific number, because that's not how it's going to get allocated. It's going to get allocated best on the kind of work you're doing, and it's still getting refined. It'll be additive from the bottom up, is what I'm saying. That's an approximate number.
Okay.
But I am not voting on a specific to the day number, because it's an approximation close of what it's going to ultimately be. But it starts from the ground up. It doesn't start from down.
I thought we knew a number for the best of 19 and 20.
Yeah, that's it. It'll be the best of 19 and 20.
Right.
But
We know that. We've known that number since April.
Well, the number's not in the ARM, so, but
guarantee you.
I guess the, are we going to change the intent of the current ARM and allow growth in the shoulders or at any time of the year beyond the current ARM or not, right? That's the, whether we figure that out right now, like that's what we're stuck on, right? So whether we vote on that now, or I think we would benefit, even if it's a conversation, as Max suggested, to know where everybody's currently on, you know, or if what else we need to learn, because that's going to give, even if it's just suggestions and public comment and from others in the work group, that's going to help tailor what our final recommendations are.
And just, you know, building off of that, we have 3 out of our 12 members that are not here tonight. I'd love to hear from them. We have a great audience that has, just from the comments I was hearing, was people said they were learning a lot and they appreciated the nuances that we're discussing. I suspect we're all going to hear from them over the next couple of weeks as well. I'd like that benefit of that information before going on record of a specific action. That's my thoughts.
What's the date of our next? large?
I think we're about a month out for the full group. Is it the 28th of April or something? But I'm assuming that we're going to be meeting as a subgroup a couple of times before that.
Turkey season, man. We consider it.
So I guess just for purposes of discussion then, because I think that's right, a formal motion to set a number doesn't make sense at this stage in the game, but getting a sense for you all where we're at.
Exactly, yeah.
For me, I think it would be a mistake to expand the pie. And I think that will ultimately create a barrier for this work group that we'll trip over later. That's my opinion. And also for me, and this is where I'm at this moment in time, happy to take in more information and other perspectives and change my mind. But for me as a sort of public representative, for me to get to a place where I'm comfortable supporting a regulatory framework for non-commercial use, it's going to be harder for me to get to a posture of support for that if we're moving the goalpost on the commercial cap that was already discussed in our. That's right.
I would say personally where I'm at on that is I've been advocating in public forums in front of the commission on multiple occasions since 2017 or 18 that, the big question we've asked for decades is when is enough, and what I see with my own eyes when I'm on the river is we're there. I will keep an open mind. I do understand there's valid points that are made, by well-educated points. But I would need to hear from a lot of my peers in the outfitting industry that that's the preference, is to grow the pie for me to feel comfortable with that. But I'll continue to keep an open mind.
Yeah, I think I agree with Zach. We're at a point where we need to sort of keep the use where it's at. And that's going to be commercial and non-commercial. And if we let the commercial grow, it's going to be harder to sell a non-commercial cap.
Allison and John?
Allison, you want to chime in?
Sure. So I agree. My gut feeling is that we put the arm in place and that's what people have been planning around. I think we all have a gut feeling that's the number we need to stay at. So that's where I lean to. The challenge is the new outfitter entry. I think there's some things to think about before the next meeting. I think, why are we sitting here? Is it to cap the overall use? And I think today that in my mind is why we are sitting here. The experience has changed, and to allow growth probably isn't the right move. I think the other challenge is this will set the stage for the non-commercial use. And when we start changing the current arm, we're pushing back a plan for the commercial users, which that's why they're sitting in the room tonight. They're anxiously awaiting how to plan their next year. And each month we push this down the road. I feel that's a little unfair to them to move forward for their business. And it also pushes back the plan for the non-commercial, which we need to commit to figuring out how we're going to collect that data to move forward. I just want to touch on some things with new outfitter entry that I sit here and think about. One is, of course, the option A does restrict entry to new outfitter entry. However, the transferability of days, if we can make that easy, I think that is a plus. I think the other issue, when you look at moving it to peak and non-peak, we allow the new outfitters to enter in the non-peak, but it'd be interesting to hear from them if they feel that's even a substantial enough movement to grow their business, because we all know they're still going to have to purchase days to be able to function in the peak, because that is where the commercial money is made for the most part. The cushion is the cushion. And so I think that's something to think about, even though we would be allowing that growth in the non-peak. Is that really substantial enough for new outfitters to make a business? Or is it a better look at saying, hey, I've known this is coming. It's not a surprise. Some people have chosen different pathways for their business to build their outfitter days and are preparing for this. And maybe aren't so hung up on getting just that little 18% to spread among all the new people. So I think those are some things to think about moving forward as we discuss. I go back and forth. I think the one I struggle with is I think we have enough people on the river, and just I want to hear from outfitters and new guides. I do want to hear what they have to say, and if they don't have time to speak in the meeting tonight, I want them to reach out to us as a committee.
Well said, Allison. Hi from Argentina. Sorry for the bad internet, and sorry I'm not there. One common theme that certainly in the commercial subcommittee and it seems in the group as a whole is how to be the least restrictive and still targeting the critical goals of the working group, i.e. Crowding on the river, avoiding confrontation at boat ramps, but not necessarily capping November and March. And so I think tonight when we push forward at picking a number, we're being premature. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We're not talking about the impact on the local Ennis economy. We're not talking about what this does to the one boat outfitter. And we're not talking about what it does to new outfitter entry. And we're giving up flexibility. We're giving up opportunity in the shoulder season without even coming close to addressing the non-commercial growth out of Bozeman and Big Sky. And here we go. We're handcuffing the outfitting community in a way that's not necessary. And so let's take our time. Let's figure out how this affects everybody, not just the great big outfitters that are stacked up with days that don't care because they've got so many days that doesn't sound appealing to put them all on their outfitter license and realize that monetary value. We're talking about everybody here, and everybody's voice needs to be listened to. And so I think we're definitely premature tonight in picking a number. Thank you very much.
Guess we're going around the circle. I would just remind everybody that we've been operating under the SRP permit system since 2007. It's going to be 15 years this coming year. The river was defined in 2007. You got your green sticker, you guide where you guide. Then in 2018, at the commission meeting, we heard plans to manage commercial use, and we heard then, I mean, it's deja vu, but we got to cap the use. In 19, with the petitions, it was cap the use. In 20, the commission finally capped the use at 19 and 20. And then the commission last year, you remember, the first thing they did was we were supposed to implement this year in January, and they pushed it to next year in January. The idea that nobody, we haven't been prepared for this, it's too soon, we need more time, we're way beyond the time. We defined it. We defined the years, we defined the cap. We need to implement it and work the details from there. Opportunity for entry is the detail we need to work on in rule. We can talk about use it or lose it. New transferability was something in 2020 we talked about needed to happen for this cap to go into place. We got transferability. And here we are in another work group, the third one, saying, oh, we need another month or we need another year. We don't implement what we got. All the outfitters have been ready to operate under that and implement it and evaluate it and tweak it and adapt it as necessary going forward.
Yeah, so I guess on my go round, I feel like there's some intellectual honesty that's got to be put forward, and we struggled through the last iteration of this in front of the commission. We ended up with the addition of 2020 to, 19 and 20. We all nodded our heads. I guess it's sort of my expectation that is what it is, and we work around it. My resistance to a hard vote is I just don't want to feel as though we let anybody down if we end up tweaking something, but it is my thinking that is what we've got. That's what and we've actually fought for it because the numbers were actually lower than what we were starting with. And we argued, well, we've got to have this, and we got it. And the number, the highest of the two best years, your highest, is higher than anything we've ever seen before. I mean, that's the intellectual honesty on it. So I think that's reality. I don't like the idea that there's no room for growth ever, because I think even anybody that runs a business knows that a no growth model is a going out of business model. But as Zach pointed out, this is quasi free market. It's quasi business because it is highly regulated. So those are the things that swirl in my head, but in general, I'm leaning toward the commitments that have been made. I would have a hard time pushing for something different than that. So you got a
Yeah, Chris McGrath, are you on?
Yeah, sure am. I think we're heading down the right track. I think I support everyone's, well, not everyone, a lot of people's comments, and not wanting to have a vote today on it, because it might be a little premature and might box us. I might have to change it further down the road as we get further down the process of deciding how we're going to deal with this. So, I want to thank everyone for all the great conversation we've had here tonight. This has been really helpful, I'm sure, for most of us. So thank you all for coming out and helping out.
I guess I've said my chief concerns really are the current shoulder dates, even at 16,200. Seeing those shoulder dates, and I think it's roughly 4,000 days, getting piled into the peak when they get sold. Because if I'm either a new outfitter, I'm probably going to be buying the cheapest possible dates I can get. And if I have the flexibility to move them into July, you bet I'm going to do that. So I think subgroup really needs to focus on that issue. And then are obligated to take a plan back to the commission on facilitating new outfitter entrants. And, if you come back on April 28th with a plan for that, and we could vote on it, that would be fantastic.
I think we've got our marching orders and thoughts there. And again, following up with those that aren't here, Chris and Jim Hart, in any way that we can to get their comments will be helpful. Just maybe a housekeeping thing. Do you have any idea when the 2021 numbers, SRP numbers, will become available? Not that we want to use those numbers, but just as a frame of reference for what the river was like this past year.
I talked to Andrew Pulse on Tuesday. In fact, it was after our last meeting. And he says he's proofing them. He's got to compare a couple outfitters. He's down to a couple proofs, but it's 18,500, which is 5,000 more than 2020.
Be interesting, Mike. Will he have the data by month or by?
Yeah,
by week?
it'll be by day.
Yeah. Okay, that would be great.
I mean, that just is useful just to be thinking, and for the outfitting community to be thinking of the implications of that. That's 2,000 some trips over the permitted amount.
Right.
Okay, let's keep the agenda moving forward. Allison, do you want to do a quick review of the new outfitter topic?
Yeah, so I mean, we've discussed, not much has changed since last time. We have discussed a lot of it tonight. I think I have the top one as the how we'll work on the new outfitter entries once we commit to, are we going to use an entire season, peak or non-peak? That really does drive how we discuss new outfitter entry mechanisms. And so with that just comes what we've talked about tonight, the kind of have it down to, you know, you have your first generation outfitters, so to speak, the ones that hold the SRP days now, and how those get transferred down to what we call a second generation or a new outfitter. And talking about changing those, the ability to transfer and that river use by getting that river use permit. The other issue that comes up on the table a lot is, you know, the peak season versus non-peak. That would allow some new outfitter entry, but really looking at what our end goal is it to contain the number of trips and then work within that, or just call the peak and non-peak our opportunity. One other option that gets discussed a lot is a distributive pool. That gets thrown out there. Do we create a distributive pool at the onset of the allocation? Is a distributed pool created with a use it or lose it policy? So those are some things to think about on those terms. And that's just a really quick summary that I think we'll get into more detail once we know which direction we're going. And also, I think just hearing from some guides and outfitters that aren't part of the group, if they could reach out to us, that would be great. Any questions at all? One thing, I just have one more thing to say. I think too, one thing to think about is, you know, I grew up in Central Oregon where we recreated with a Deschutes River plan. I mean, that is more restricted than anything in Montana we would probably be used to. But Central Oregon is a victim of growth, victim of circumstance. And one thing I'll share with you is, although the growth in the economic health of Central Oregon is vibrant, but when I go back home and use the river, my experience on the river hasn't changed over that time. And I think that's something that we need to think about, living near the fastest growing county, and Madison will be as a consequence of those growing people. And do we want that experience to stay the same? So I think as we move forward in these next few weeks, it's really something to think about and look at how that affects you in the future as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Allison, on the distribution pool concept, is that intended to be a temporary place for unused days so it eventually dries up, or is it meant to be replenished regularly so that it's a sort of sustained resource for potentially new outfitters?
It could be both ways. There could be an original distributive pool, but one thing that's talked about to keep it healthy would be a look at some way of distributing back into that pool. Maybe if there was a current outfitter would give so many days upon initiation and then in 10 years, so to speak, or does that distributive pool get filled back up with a use it or lose it type thing?
So the big hole Beaverhead, wasn't that they had that concept, but it was finite and that it eventually dried up, right?
It was gone in a few years, correct?
Yeah, it started out at 2,000 user days.
So that seems
Those
like
were temporary, and had them for 5 years, and then they became permanent.
So one guy's 2 cents, just thinking of that history, is avoiding that outcome seems like a opportunity for us to learn a lesson there and think about a way to make it a replenished and more sustainable resource to the industry.
More than just a one-time benefit.
Any other questions for Allison? Thanks, Allison. John, you want to bring us up to speed on the FAS improvement topic?
Yeah, sure. Charlie Sperry, were you able to find those documents that I dropped off for Eileen and distribute them to everybody?
We're doing that right now, John.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just very briefly, you'll see the documents that are being distributed, what Mike Bias, Brian McGeehan, myself, and Jay Pappy from the Parks Department reviewed all the boat ramps. This is a preliminary proposal here. Casey has indicated to us we have $50,000 for 3 boat ramps that we could identify. We identified the boat ramps that need most critical upgrades as Lyons, Varney, and the town of Ennis. And you start from the top, we've got Lyons is the first one that's fairly straightforward. We proposed a second or a third boat ramp up high near the existing latrine and expanding the parking. That parking is a little bit ambiguous and can be more defined as to how we increase that back boat trailer parking. As we move down, the next page is for Varney. This is a little bit more involved. We'd like to do a boat ramp there as well. That in and of itself would probably be $50,000 or more for a concrete boat ramp. It's fairly involved. But if we couldn't get the boat ramp done, we can do all of the other items probably for in the neighborhood of 50,000, which is removing all of the campsites as you pull into Varney. Everybody's in our group anyway has identified that they're dangerous, they're in the way. They could be better used in the back end of that FAS area where I've mapped out 6 campsites there, and we could use the nice parks fire pits that they've got, make defined gravel parking areas. I proposed putting in a latrine, a second latrine that would service the campsites there. Right now we're getting that property that's adjacent to the FAS there is property I manage. It's right next to my lodge, and getting people that climb the fence and are using the latrine in the field. It'd be nice to have those campsites have an established latrine. Just putting some more gravel on the existing parking area. The final one is the Ennis, the town of Ennis, and we're doing a number of things there to increase parking. We're expanding the existing boat ramp that's there so we could launch 2 boats simultaneously. We're taking out, proposing to take out rather campsites that are right near the boat ramp area to prevent confrontation, potential confrontation and safety, and moving them back into upstream to the south. Yeah, that's kind of where we are right now. Lyons is a boat ramp that's owned by the National Forest Service and in collaboration with the Parks Department. Parks Department takes care of servicing the latrines and any other maintenance. And so that's a collaborative effort. And Charlie, my understanding is you may be taking that over from Jay Pappy, or is that not the case? Not the case.
Well, I mean, I think you caught me by surprise here. I think that.
Sorry.
The program is still, I mean, Jay will be involved. I think though we've got a couple other folks though that are certainly going to be very much attuned to this conversation.
Sure, sure.
John, if I might just I'm trying to keep quiet as much as possible. I think on the Lions one, it is worth mentioning. You did point it out. That is a Forest Service. You know, we leased that ground from the Forest Service. They've been patiently awaiting to see what this group would come up with for recommendation. But just to be clear, that is Forest Service property that would be subject to whatever decisions, direction they would want to go with in their processes for development improvements, et cetera. So
Yes, Charlie, and I've been told by Joel that could be a year or two out in their process. My thought is that we could move forward more quickly with Varney and Ennis, and certainly nothing, the parts of the process that don't involve touching stream bank and the river, i.e. fire pits, parking areas, can move forward more quickly. And that will be my goal as I press forward on these projects.
Charlie, maybe you can help me. I mean, we need to get the budget on these projects in front of the director as soon as we can. My understanding, John, is that it's $50,000 per FAS for 150 total.
That's my understanding as well.
Mine as well.
Okay.
I think what Commissioner Walsh, what we can do, when this group is ready to pitch a recommendation regarding these FAS improvements, I think if, in this case, that would be pointed at the department. I think that would be up to the director to determine, is that something that we would take that recommendation on, pursue it, and then we would have staff scope that out. I mean, there is a process we go through that would be required for us to get a sense of cost, but we can put together some preliminary information, at least on the two that are FWP jurisdiction.
And John, you might think about another option on an FWP, and we'll put the Lions project into a longer term plan.
I think that makes great sense. And Charlie, I'll reach out to you. I'm back on Monday, and maybe you and I could have lunch together and discuss this in person.
Sounds good, John.
Thank you.
Any other questions for John? Mac, I know Dave had to leave, but you want to give a quick update on the ambassador pilot?
No problem there. So the ambassador program, for all practical purposes, I think we've completed our scoping work and our discussions, our plans. It's rooted in the same thing that the FAS improvements are, and that is the lion's share of the issue back in the day was related to boat traffic and congestion in and out of the FAS sites. So this program would be largely spearheaded on the ground by John with the Montana River Foundation. Dave Cumline has provided a tremendous amount of work and outlining. We've gotten together and got a schedule. We've brought in other outfitters and others to figure out what that should look like. We've got a budget in mind, and now it's a matter of handing it over to John and seeing what we can do. We had preliminary discussions with the department. They've handed it off to BLM. So you sort of need a pat on the head and say it's okay to put somebody out there to be a traffic cop, but they're not really gonna have a hands-on relationship. So this is not an enforcement position. This isn't even really conceived as a huge data collection. This is more of a campground host. It's more of a helper. It's more of an educator. And the concept was a couple of interns working with the Montana River Foundation would be the roving crew that would go through it. And there's been actually quite a bit of work done on outlining how that would go down and when it would go down, what sites they'd be on. So
in this department, I think it's be this office, but are they supportive of this effort?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yes, absolutely. They're not going to, and talking to Dustin Temple over it, this is not something they're going to take on. They are fully expecting it to be done through, something external to them and external to BLM. But those partnership programs exist on Clarkport, and they exist in a couple of other places. So we've got a great template to work from. I fully expect it's going to be in place this summer.
Great.
Mac, in that, I'm a little familiar with the Clarkport Bitterroot one.
Yeah.
They do sort of annual work evaluation at the end of the year. Is one.
I'm sure we haven't discussed it that far. The next final step really for us is the drafting of a real operational plan, and the reporting requirements would have to be incorporated into that. I mean, they really would.
But one of the issues that arose in our discussion was that this not get used as some kind of soft science, quasi-science that comes back to bite us. If we're gonna use this as an instrument to collect data, then the department needs to be involved in designing and analyzing that data. This isn't gonna be done by, a volunteer group, because of the integrity issues we might have of the data. So, but it would definitely have to have a report.
Just one correction, Mac, it's Madison River Foundation.
Did I say, man?
You kept saying Montana.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Madison.
All right, thanks, Mac. Last but not least, yep,
Can I go back really quickly to John, just to,
yep.
I apologize for not asking this earlier, but
I'm not
just,
sure John's still on, but we'll see.
and maybe it's just a comment for Charlie on the Varney proposal. I just wanted to clarify that would be a net increase in developed campsites in what John's proposing. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't want to, yeah, I don't, Zach, I'm sorry, I don't want to speak for John. If he's on, maybe he could answer that, but I wouldn't be comfortable.
I was at the site visit, and help me out if isn't there currently 2 campsites at Varney on the entrance?
Yes.
Three. On the way in, is it 3?
There's 3.
4 before you get to the boat ramp? So the thought was to have this be more boat rigging and then develop campsites here. So this is just a big open field right now. That was
And
that was
instead
the
of
thought
having
process.
100 cars driving by your campsite every day, you'd be a little bit more remote.
Yeah, I guess my comment, John's not on, but Charlie, if you talk to John, would just be if the net availability of camping on this site increases, I think that's a good thing. And if moving these campsites removes an opportunity for folks to camp at Varney, that's a negative, right? I mean, that's just sort of an obvious principle to state, but I think it's.
Yeah, it wasn't set up to be in that box, or they were gonna nuke those 4, that they would be relocated.
And logistically, that makes sense. This is a weird place to camp because of all the car traffic. I understand that, but anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. Be real.
Thanks, Zach. Last but not least, Brian, want to give us an update?
Yeah. A few.
Before we go on, Casey, this is Jim. Could I ask you a question?
Yeah, Jim, welcome.
Well, I've been listening all night, but the last thing that I think I heard was some information based on the Madison River Foundation. I missed what that was.
You want to explain?
Yeah, Jim, Mac here, Madison River Foundation, through John. Idea would be that they could provide the oversight and logistical support for the volunteers doing the ambassador program, on site. And so that's the partnership that would logically develop.
And Mac would use their 501c3 to raise funds for.
Yeah, obviously a 501c3, they're able to generate the money. They've actually already gone as far as to line up and hire the interns. We're working on the operations plan to make sure that the schedule and the sample design and all that stuff is done, up to snuff. But that's kind of the model for right now.
Okay, thank you for that. I just might add, and I'll do a little research myself on what the Missouri Madison River Fund does as far as counting on each of the fishing access sites, and I'll be able to find that out before the next meeting.
Okay.
Right.
Sure. On the non-commercial, I think consensus is have a few proposals ready to go to come in either simultaneously or immediately behind whenever the commercial is finalized. I've been working within several members of the work group, Rich and Allison and Zach have been a lot of help in generating ideas. And I've also been trying to reach out to members in the community, in the Ennis community, MGTU, in Bozeman, and just gauging the litmus test of it in general. What's the appetite for a collective solution to, the river? And there's a strong appetite, I would say, to do something on the non-commercial side in the community. Charlie's been really helpful. Charlie helped kind of fact check me in clarifying some of the ARM rule. So it does look like there's substantial ARM related to river recreation on the fish and wildlife side. So it's quite liberal. And that this relative to the entire river corridor, the state basically is the best governing body to manage river recreation. So probably one of the things we're leaning towards is to recommend a river-wide recreation plan, probably from the park boundary to the end, with the state taking the lead and developing partnerships with the land managers such as the Forest Service and the BLM. And the intent is to avoid any type of patchwork solution, but have something where there's very similar to the Arkansas River model, where Forest Service, BLM, and the state work in partnership, although the state takes the lead in that management. The wade fishing versus float fishing, I think we're leaning towards passive monitoring of wade fishing, looking at like BLM car count, for example. And if we see that grow by 25, 30%, evaluate that. On the float side, recognizing that watercrafts, the idea of like they do with the snow geese, where they require the mandatory permit, but to require a watercraft pass that will allow us to collect data and then possible have a multi-year plan of what to do with that data when that comes in, to present, and then get guidance from the work group and then from Charlie and what's the best way to execute that, and do we take that step by step? Is it presented as one nut to the commission, et cetera? So that's sort of where we're at. Mike?
Brian, we do car counts at $3 Bridge at Reynolds?
Yep. Yeah, there's really rich data going back over 10 years. And if Chris is still on, and we have those reports, they're in there. So I encourage y'all to review those.
Pine Butte on there too, or?
I forget about Pine Butte. And what's really remarkable is the pandemic effect. Even though commercial use actually declined in 20, we know it went up in 21. But going from 19 to 20 at the fishing access sites, there was a 67% increase in activity on the upper river and a 76% increase in activity on the lower river of cars moving in and out of access sites. So what we all kind of saw was supported by, just what happened during the pandemic in usage.
Any questions?
You talk about watercraft, are you including the pleasure floaters on the lower?
I think we'll have to. I have talked with Jeff Kitchens, who's the BLM recreation manager on the Deschutes. And I specifically asked, is that a big issue there for boarders and tubers, because they have that activity on certain reaches, and it's there's a high level of it works well. Everybody gets their passes, and even if they're tubing. So I think that, yes, that would be the plan. It might be a slightly, we're talking about possibly a high use pass where you might allow large parties, but geographically confined from Warm Springs to Gray Cliff, for example. That might be a separate pass, and then have another kind of reservation where you're limited to 4 watercraft that you could go anywhere up and down the river. But if all you want to do is tube with 15 of your college buddies, you could get a specific high volume pass, but that is geographically constrained and possibly seasonally constrained as well. So try to keep it really, really simple, but also collect the data we need, and then possibly then have a tool later as a management tool like we see on many other rivers.
So Brian, I think the objective would be to take this to the commission on August 25th.
Yep.
But have it pretty well thought out in terms of how the logistics on it would work.
Yeah, I
You know,
agree.
whether the department, what it's gonna take to execute.
Yep, yeah, and there'll be a technology, the realistic way this is done in many other states, when you issue a watercraft pass, is there's an online format.
Right.
Possibly you could still have a walk-in fly shops, et cetera, might have here you go. And then they report it digitally. But the way it's typically done is you have a Reserve America or a, recreation.gov where you go on and log in and print your pass. And then initially it would be unrestricted. There'd be no limit to the number of passes issued. In other states, they do set an upper boundary on how many passes get issued. And Chris has also asked for some guidance in the bear trap. So we'll likely do that. And one thing we probably, going back to commercial, we've discussed, we at some point want to circle around to the boat delivery business. There is, by the way, ARM that specifically addresses boat rental delivery in Montana. So we'll have to kind of not forget about that as well.
To that end, that's one segment of this team that isn't represented. If we're going to talk about the commercially permitted transporters, those two folks, if we're going to bring that in, we're going to need somebody from that community.
Yeah, and actually, Casey and I had a chance to meet with Bill Zell, the owner of Montana Whitewater. They run really the only significant boat delivery rental service, and they were very insightful. Him and Ethan is head boater, and I'm sure either one or both of those would be willing to come in and present and for us to ask questions and
and help develop a regulatory plan.
Yep.
Because they're a commercial user just like you are, and at some point we need to be talking about how that's going
to. And they were very aware of the need for that and amenable and open to that.
Just to throw in, I agree with that a lot. And just a piece of context to share is that conflict at bridge sites in Gallatin County is going bonkers right now. And it's driven by, Joe Public wanting to jump bridges and go tubing and whatnot. But you're starting to see bridges on the Jefferson and the Madison, lower Madison and the Gallatin fill up with bus loads of tubers from probably Montana Whitewater as well.
Yeah,
and so if you overregulate on the lower Madison, you just push people elsewhere, and that problem isn't going to be solved by this group or whatever. But we should be mindful of just how we approach it.
And Chris McGrath, if you're still on, can speak. Currently, the parking capacities on the Lower River are frequently exceeded on weekends. And we already see even in the lower Madison pioneering launches, people driving up the Bear Trap Canyon Road and walking tubes across. So that's a problem that's experienced frequently already in the Lower River.
Yeah, we're well over carrying capacity for our rec sites and our staff capacity to handle more visitors in the lower Madison. Influx of visitors, and then we're probably at that point before the pandemic, but a 76% increase is made that point right home for a lot of us. So, I mean, we're literally
one last
to ignore our no parking signs and park on hills. We don't because we have a parking lot for 100 vehicles and 500 vehicles.
One comment, Zach, you made, which is a very good one, on the non-commercial side, it will be very important to have some trusted sponsors within the community. There's going to, no matter what, there'll be at some point, even if it's a free unlimited permit requiring Joe Public to jump through a hoop, we'll have some opposition. And so it's going to be extremely, we know that it's very doable and very widely accepted and supported in many other states and other rivers where these plans exist. It is a little foreign here in Montana. And so making sure when we get close to developing some recommendations to communicate with members of the general public and possibly get some endorsements by, maybe our local Trout Unlimited chapter, maybe, some of those trusted voices that don't have a vested interest in outfitting for hotels and us. And the NS community as well, right? You know, I think if we could get some backing from the NS community, from as many trusted voices as we can, we've got a chance at accomplishing something.
Thanks, Brian. Let's move into public comment. I'm gonna move over here so I don't run back to you. Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in there, Casey. Commissioner Walsh and working group, thank you all very much for all your hard work. I know this is really challenging, difficult set of issues that you're facing. So thank you for that. And thank you for the opportunity to comment. Nothing really that new from me. Pretty much a zero growth proponent. I believe strongly that the ARM rule that's already been passed, 16,127 trips, is sufficient to maintain our community, our economy, and most importantly, the quality of the experience there on the Madison River. I think there's a lot of opportunity within that number for existing people to maneuver and grow if that's what they're looking to do, as well as to offer some path to new entry. I understand the concern about one annual cap allowing too much shoulder season use to migrate into the peak season. There's no question that's the path of least resistance for some of those days. So, you know, if a peak season cap needs to be a part of that, you guys are going to figure that out. But I think the risk is probably greater that if you allow some level or unlimited level, and not that you've suggested that, but growth in the shoulder seasons, that you're going to see 4,000 trips move from the peak into the shoulder, which is probably more probable and higher risk to the quality of the experience for everybody, particularly the locals, and at a more vulnerable time for the river and the resource when spawning is happening, and quite frequently the river is really low like it is right now. So I would encourage you to, I think that is the most important thing. As Mike said, it's the 800-pound gorilla or elephant in the room, and I would encourage you to just stick with what's been decided, the greater of 2019 or 2020. I think everything else will fall into place from there. So thank you again.
Thanks, Joe.
Of course, I'd have to say comfort, sorry. No, thank you, everybody. It was really helpful. I do want to ask you if you could please share the site improvement information on the site. I am especially concerned about Barney and the safety issue at getting your boats out for clients and people in their boats. It was very concerning the last 2 summers. I really appreciated Zach's comments. Right on. Thank you so much. And I appreciate that we have an opportunity to talk with all of you later, and I will partake in that. Thanks.
Just another comment is, and I see Commissioner Byworth here tonight, is just please get involved during the public comment period, both written and show up to the commission. Hopefully the June meeting. Thought?
No, I got something to say. I would like to remind you that on these graphs that we're looking at, these graphs are between 2017 and 2020. 2020, we had just over 13,000. In 2021, we've grown 5,000 days to 18,000. So there's a dramatic increase somewhere that we don't know about in here. Was it during the peak days? Was it in here in the spring? We also have an error in here because between 2017 and 2020, we had a year during 2019 when the river was closed, and we're not closed. We had no people here because of the travel restrictions during COVID. So can we really even, was it 20? Time flies when you're having fun. But anyways, one of those years, we're 25% short on data, because that's 1 out of the 4 years that there really wasn't commercial
We have
use.
that data. We just used and disseminated these charts more to demonstrate the seasonality discussion, not to be specific to.
But do you see where 25% during the months of April and May could be misleading in here?
And again, those were just for general purposes.
Okay, well, I just want to make sure you guys' decisions are based on bad information. And with that, I'll yield the rest of the time. I know there's plenty of other people that want to speak.
Thanks, Todd. And we're just getting to 21 data,
Yeah.
right?
No, I'm just saying that we need to look at that.
My name is Joe Moore from West Yellowstone. Thanks for all your work and time and energy and putting into this and allotting some time at the end of these. You know, shoulder seasons is a really wrong way to think about this, right? As far as the resource is concerned, that river for a majority of it from Mac down was open year round, but having a shoulder season, just use what you're allotted, right? Like, let's not teach some new outfitters that the shoulder seasons is the time to go in there and pound on the river. Like that's not a great idea. Like there's a conservation idea behind all of this on that, you know, use what you get. I think West Yellowstone feels that way. I've been there for 24 years or something like that, guiding for 22 of them. And, you know, I won't speak for everybody, but I've talked to a lot of them and just cap it and keep it what it is. Use what you get for the whole year. I mean, it's not a peak season anymore. If you haven't noticed, that river's busy. As far as the public is concerned, I think you need to look at the Yellowstone National Park and the .gov and how many of those reservations, if you will, are allowed to be done way in advance. And if people actually go back and cancel them, if they're not going to use them, that's been a problem in the Park Service and the Forest Service. So I would look at that model as far as, you know, that's being instituted this summer. I mean, those days in the park they're gone, and so many people don't have service or they don't think about, I should cancel these. Somebody else might want to use them, right? And so a lot of those days have been snapped up pretty quick in the park.
Joe, to speak to that point, which is a very, very good one. So there are some models where it's like one batch is dropped, like in Michigan in January, and that's it. And if you don't go on, you're not going to go out July 3rd. Some of the newer models, like in Oregon, they release batches and waves and up until like the week before, which is especially important to locals. This is assuming that there's eventually a limit on the number of passes. But that would be a very important thing to look at, especially for Montana residents that tend to make their recreation decisions much closer to the day of the float.
Right on. Well, one other thing is that river should be closed in certain sections during the spawn. It just should be. Most every person in this room, right on this side anyway, thinks that. And West Yellowstone definitely thought that. All of us wrote in for that. That got flipped. Give it a break, man. I mean, we're all in here trying to give it a break. We're all advocating for, you know, use your days during the whole season. There's no peak. There's no shoulder. It's one season. Thank you.
Thanks. Next.
I'm also from West Yellowstone, and I've been a guide on the river since 2001 and an outfitter Montana since 2004, and also have a few PH2 days. I agree with a lot of what both Joe and Joe said, and we are educators as outfitters and fishing guides, and we operate at the demand of the public. It's the public who pays us to take them fishing. And part of our job is protecting the resource and educating our clients to do the same thing. And so I feel like there's a little bit of an animosity that gets built up of that, the non-commercial versus the commercial at times, but it's the public paying us to go fishing and to take them out on the river and for that experience. So I appreciate the opportunity to make a public comment and to add that in. The other thing I would say is, Charlie, I attended a few CAC meetings in West Yellowstone and up here in Bozeman and some of the other work group meetings after that. And we've been through this process a lot. So I encourage you to keep working at it and getting through the hard parts because we want a plan. And I want to see an evaluation period after that with the option for adaptations in that, which would include our public comment and the other users of the river. And I think you can work through what you're dealing with right now, get to a plan, and then evaluate it and come back to the table and keep, I don't want to say keep beating a dead horse, but get a plan in place so that we can work with something. Thank you.
We're trying. Any other public comment?
Well, yes, I will. I'm Pat Barth. I'm the commissioner in Region 3, and I've been tracking this issue since I was a biologist back in the early 2000s. I appreciate the work you've done. This is really compelling. You put a lot of work in on all your subcommittees, and it's impressive stuff. Thank you. And thank you also, Dan, you expressed an interest in hearing from the public. And I want to express that too. Lately, this last year, communications with the public have been regulated in ways that we're not used to, either as a commissioner or as an angler or as a Montanan. And so, you know, I respect the process and let the work group work, but for me, if I don't hear from you till the day of the commission meeting, I'm not as well informed as I should be. So I'll ask you if you want to talk to me tonight, or you want to email me or call me. I need to hear the input as this proceeds, because otherwise, and there's, you know, 5 others between Casey and I, who also, it's a lot to learn in 2 weeks before the June meeting. So don't be shy about contacting me. I won't speak for Casey, but we got to learn. I mean, this is complicated, and I've been studying this for a long time myself, and still I need to hear from you. So don't be shy. Grab me before you leave tonight. Email me, call me. I need to get a better comprehensive understanding of what's going on in your minds. You know, it's great, and I appreciate the chance to attend these meetings and learn from you.
Comments?
Justin, Edge, out there, Ennis, I would echo the same thing the rest of the previous commenters out there said. Joe, both the Joes. We've got a plan, you know, it hasn't really had a chance to hit the ground running yet, so it makes me nervous to have to go back and start thinking about changing that plan before we even get it implemented. I agree with a lot of what Mike Bias had to say tonight. And yeah, I think we just get a plan, stick with it, reevaluate, and yeah.
I'm Eric Shores. I've been here for a long time. I've been coming to this meeting for 40 years. 40 years I've been coming to this meeting. And it looks like we're finally gonna get it done. I mean, here to all you guys, man, it's taken 40 years to get here. And I just encourage you, know, don't take the teeth out of it by allowing shoulder seasons. That just throws everything out. Let nature and they'll decide when the shoulder seasons are. That'll naturally take care of itself. Just don't move the goalposts and let nature and everything else figure out what happens in the middle. Yeah, we might get a bulge in July, but you know, classical predator-prey relationship. When too many predators show up, predators leave. You know, it's going to get too annoying to be a crowd, so people will leave. I think things will shake out fine. Just don't move the goalposts, all right? Because that is going to totally screw us when it comes to going to the public and go, okay, now we want to shut you down. Well, you can't seem to shut yourselves down. So, Mike, don't move the goalposts. That's all. I'm a single boat outfitter. Don't move the goalposts.
I make one more reference, Casey.
Sure.
I would like to just also add, if you're talking about the shoulder seasons, go with the weather and everything. Go this Saturday to the Madison River between Ennis and Lions Bridge. Take a look at how many boats you see this weekend. And that'll give you a good idea on the shoulder season, 70 degrees.
Lower rivers already busy.
Barney's already there.
Anyone else? Really appreciate everyone turning out tonight. Thanks for being here. Thanks especially to the work group for putting in a lot of hours on this important topic. And so let's just confirm our next meeting date. Is it April 28th? Yep, 5:30 here. And
We'll be working.
We'll be working. Like the, go with, yeah, I think so.